Good morning, everybody. Good morning to all the colleagues who've made it here to Brussels. Good morning to those of you who've joined us online. Welcome to the 6th Annual Forum for FAIR. This work in anti-doping and recreational sport has carried on for a number of years now, and we're coming toward the end of the present project. I'm going to invite Cliff Collins from Europe Active in a moment to come and say a little bit about this. But welcome to the day. My name is Mike McNamee. I'm a professor in KU Leuven and also in Swansea University, and I've been working with Europe Active around doping in recreational sport for the best part of a decade now, I think. It's great to see the fruition of this work today. You've all received, I guess, an outline of the program. We're splitting this day two into halves. We had a great session last night with Tony Cunningham from WADA, with Jürgen Sesember from the Flemish NADO, and with Dr. Monika Frenger from Saarland University. We're continuing those themes today, very much the connection between research, policy, and practice. So great that we have so many different stakeholders that have been able to join us. So we'll work through the first session. We have two technical groups who will be presenting work to you during the day today. The first technical group is a group of researchers. I'll introduce those shortly. And in the afternoon, we'll have the other technical group from the NADO representatives and with the talk from Tony Cunningham, and with other experts during the day as well. So it's going to be a full day. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to move along very swiftly over to Cliff Collins, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the history of this project and how we got here.
Good morning. My name's Cliff Collins. I'm the Senior Advisor for Europe Active. That's the Pan-European Association for the Fitness Sector. And I've been involved in the anti-doping and recreational sport theme now since about 2010, in fact. So it's been a huge learning curve for me. And this really is why today is such an important occasion. From all of the work which has gone on over the years, and I will do a little summarising of that later on. I'm saying this is an important occasion today because we're going to be confirming the findings from the largest sample-based ever survey conducted into the use of performance-enhancing substances in recreational sport. And on the back of that, we'll also give an insight into the investigation into the societal and psychological motivations behind the use of doping by recreational athletes. They're pretty big words, and you can imagine the discussions we've had in this project about definitions and who's included, who's excluded, and you begin to scratch the surface, and there are more and more and more and more questions underneath all of this, underneath these layers. But our project also had two other key objectives. The other main area of work was focused on the mapping of educational guidelines for coaches, instructors, and trainers in recreational sport. We've developed new guidelines through this project, which can be used by various stakeholders and professional groups who are actively involved in recreational sport to help develop, monitor, evaluate, and improve their anti-doping educational programs. Now, the FAIR Plus project is now ending. We've got just to the end of this year to conclude all of our business. But there is a real clear imperative, in my view, that work in this area continues. And consequently, we have drafted what we call a commitment for action, which is, if you like, is a sort of or kind of roadmap for future considerations in this very, very important area of work. Now, both of our FAIR projects have been co-funded by the European Commission through the Erasmus Plus programme, and we are very grateful for their support to this point. Without that funding, it's been absolutely crucial. We would not have been able to undertake any of this work and bring these great people together for all of these years. So later today, we'll be very pleased to welcome, I hope I get his name correct, Georg Haeusler. I think that's fairly close. He's the Director for Culture, Creativity and Sport in the European Commission. In other words, he's pretty high up the order here. He's a very important guy. And he will address this forum later on this afternoon and he will outline proposed future policy development in this area. And we are interested, as Mike was saying, in the research, the development of policy and into practice. This is really what this whole mix of the FAIR project has been about. So I would like to take the opportunity, as we're beginning to head towards the end of the FAIR project, to personally thank the project partners for their professionalism and commitment. Genuinely, they have made this project a great success. You're going to hear about this great work over the coming rest of today. And despite all of the problems that COVID-19 managed to throw at us, with business lives, personal lives being very, very seriously disrupted, we've all experienced this. They found solutions. Every time we had a problem in the project, these people came together to find really good solutions, to make sure that the outcomes are really, really world-class thinking, and I think you're going to benefit from hearing all of this great work being condensed and summarized today. We will publish all of the findings in our report. That will be ready on our website before the end of this year. It's completely free to use. There's no charge. The European Commission have funded this work, so it will be freely accessible. And over the years, you can see that the work we have done has been embedded into three main pieces of work, which the first two are published. We did the study on doping, prevention, which was published in 2016, eventually, and that was really on the back of the EU expert group on doping in recreational sport. That was the first time, I think, the Commission brought together national as well as other experts to look into this problem, and it became such a huge issue that the Commission had to organise a group of experts to advise the experts on the direction, and out of that came a request for the study on doping prevention, which was to look at a map of the regulatory and controls and what systems and processes existed across the then 28 member states of the European Union. It was a pretty groundbreaking piece of work here, and many of the people who are working on the FAIR project today were involved way back then. So we do have this long-term relationship, which I think has really helped in terms of that understanding. You know, we trust each other in this work. It's not one against the other. You know, opinions are very well received, and there's been, I think, a very open attitude to have a look at the evidence there. You know, this is what we've been really trying to drive at through this FAIR Plus project, is really what is actually the landscape out there. So that was a very important piece of work, and out of that bounced our first FAIR project, which we completed in 2019. And it was a fairly weighty document we produced at the end of it. If you have the appetite, you can download a copy of it. It's on our website. Again, there's absolutely no charge for that. And it really began to have a look at the evidence-driven outcomes of actions, what was actually out there, what was working, what wasn't working, what do we need to do next. And the next step then was the creation of the FAIR Plus project, with these three main objectives, as I said. The other thing through the two FAIR projects has been this occasion, the FAIR Forum, where we like to welcome people to come physically. And thank you all again for those who've made the journey here today. It's a bit difficult in Belgium generally because there's a strike taking place, so transports are very severely disrupted. But one of the benefits we had over the last 2 years is to record and live stream this event. So it's a lovely unintended consequence of COVID that we have this facility now to go live streaming all across the world. There are 50, 60 more people around the world joining us today. And of course we will record this session today, so you can have playback and look at the highlights and consider some of the points of view which are being made. So it's an incredible journey that we've been on this time. I step out at the end of this year. That's my tour of duty done, I think. I'm very happy to hand over to other people who are like-minded and want to see the next generation coming through. So we have this commitment for future action. We hope the European Commission will stay in there with the money. None of this would happen without the project partners and others, and my expert team in Europe Active, who sometimes I'd rather have the impression that keeping my partners here, who are very strong people, very strong characters at times, it's a bit like herding cats, you know. We have to get them all in the right place at the right time with the right outcomes, and that's been quite challenging. So hats off to my colleagues in Europe Active who've somehow managed to hold that together and get us to this successful conclusion. And behind the scenes here, and really the glue, the motivator, the person who's really held things together and at times been very critical, quizzical, thought-provoking, is Professor Michael McNamee, who again is our convener for today. And Mike, I'm very indebted to your continued attention in this work. It's very, very much appreciated. So I can wrap up at this point and say thank you so much. We have two world-class presentations today as well from Tony and from April. So you're going to hear their views on the work which we've been doing in this project. We have a sign-off, last thing, by the Commission this afternoon for this commitment to future action. There's a whole lot of information you're going to be hearing and learning about today that we've discovered in this project. I hope you do enjoy that. You take away some really good thoughts as well. It is a forum, so we do invite you to interact with us, to ask questions, to post questions. If we can't answer them today, we'll do our absolute best to do so in the future, and we'll get back to you. So the journey continues. It doesn't end necessarily with this, shouldn't end necessarily with this, but it's just going to set the focus and the future for our next steps and considerations. So again, my huge thanks to the project partners who have done an absolutely amazing job over all of these years. Thank you very much to all of you. And Mike, back to you.
We're going to start from Technical Expert Group 1 in just a moment. And one of the themes I think you'll see all through the day is multi-word, multidisciplinary, multi-methods from both sets of technical expert groups, and multi-stakeholder. So we're operating in a very, very challenging political domain. And the first study flagged up the legal and also regulatory challenges of trying to operate in this sphere, because most of the people in this room grew up, I guess, with the idea of anti-doping in elite sport with WADA. They developed a frame of reference. There was 20 years of great research being done. And this agenda of recreational sport has been bubbling along in the background. To what extent is doping really about fairness in sport? To what extent is it about public health and or the health of the elite athlete? There's kind of a Venn diagram going on here with different kinds of emphases and stakeholders. But in the first technical group, we're going to have my colleagues from Saarland University and from Aarhus and from the University of Rome, Sapienza. So I'll allow them to introduce themselves and to the projects. The presentation will last until about 10 past 11. Then you've got a short break for coffee, and maybe you can formulate some nice, precise questions. I'm sorry to say to the online folks, we won't be taking questions from you, but please do feed them in. But we will take questions from the room. So I'm going to start you off with Dr. Monika Frenger from Saarland University. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. I will present or start with the presentation of the Technical Expert Group 1. My colleague will step in, we'll make a fluent change in our group so that we share the presentation. You see the colleagues from Rome University, Sapienza, Andrea Chirico, Ask Vest Christiansen from Aarhus, and my colleague Werner from Saarland University, and myself in a slide. As Cliff already mentioned, the FAIR project is a long-term topic, and the first steps were already mentioned. What I want to introduce today is the results, or how we deal with the second topic, the second objective, and our work was, in the first step, the topic of prevalence. So the old question of why, if we don't know if there is something in this field, the prevalence of doping or something else in the field of recreational sports, we don't know how to interact with this topic. So the question of prevalence and also social and psychological motivations of recreational athletes and in recreational sports. How did we do that? So what we know, prevalence studies in doping are typically because of doping controls. We know about doping controls in elite sports and how many athletes were tested positive, negative. That's a sort of prevalence. We have athletes and journals examinations and accounts. We have some investigations of authorities, police, states, or other organizations. And there are also surveys from researchers, and we want to present another survey from researchers. But there is also other methods, and Mike mentioned multi-methods are in this field, and maybe we can paint the picture better with these multi-methods. So water waste epidemiology is there, but if it's the right way for recreation sports, we decided for a survey. So COVID hit us, and the survey timeline looks very weird. We tried to have a survey in 2021 and ask people on their behavior of 2020. That's not possible because COVID hit us all. Sport was shut down, recreational sports, gyms were shut down. And if you want to ask a person, how did you act last year when everything was completely weird, the whole world was flipped around, we don't get good results. So we discussed a lot, as you mentioned already. We discussed, okay, just let's wait. What happens if COVID hits longer? We don't know. And then we decided to ask in 2021, in the spring of 2021, and ask the athletes on their behavior in 2019, with the risk of recall bias. We know that. We ask people, how did you act 2 years before? We know that, but it was the second best option. We had no COVID bias, and that's our decision. So the questionnaire and the results are done in 2021, but we asked the people on their behavior in 2019. We disseminated the survey around Europe. The darker blue countries were our sample, so we had Norway, Denmark, United Kingdom, Germany, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Cyprus inside, 8 countries, and we disseminated it. We are more or less typical snowball sampling, but we used social media help and some students in each country. We had student assistants in each country that worked with specific Facebook groups or social media platforms like Instagram, so that then can post, can interact in those groups and disseminate or survey, use newsletters, other platforms, try to step into Facebook groups, and we shared the experience between the countries. So if a student assistant has a really good strategy to address some groups, they shared it, and we tried it in the other country. But what we see is that there are also differences, because people act different in the different countries. The method. The first method to get the prevalence informations, we decided, as we presented last year already more in detail, the randomized response technique. So I just want to give a short introduction and not go deep inside, because doping and use of medication is a sensitive issue. We think that people don't want to answer or have a specific feeling if they answer. And for the sensitive questions, we decided to use the RRT. We can be sure to reduce this social desirability bias better than in a direct questioning. And we can compare the results to studies in elite sports. That's also a second argument for the RRT. So more reliable responses compared to direct questioning and in comparison to other results to avoid this social desirability bias. Just to give you one example that you have an idea of this method, in the first step, if you are asked for the use of medication or doping, we first give the persons a random number, or say choose a random number we presented them. They can choose from a list of 10 or 20. They have to choose one number. First step. Second step, we say, okay, check your number. And before you answer the question, check the last digit or the second last digit. In this example, if it's a 1, 3, or 2, please answer the question on the right side. That's presented at the bottom. And that's an easy question. So that's every week has 7 days. So the answer should be yes if they calculate right. If you have 4 or 5, answer the question on the left. That should lead to a no answer. And otherwise, if you have another number on your serial number or the random number that people choose, they have to answer the question, and that's the doping question. So here we ask, when participating in basketball in 2019, so we ask them, what's your sport? Did you participate in competitions? And depending on that, we put the question together. Only those who participate in basketball get this question, and others get the question for triathlon or for athletics or for swimming. Did you knowingly use prohibited substances or methods to enhance your sporting performance? And that's the answer we are interested in, but because of this process, we don't know if a yes answer is the answer to the question in the middle, or it's just the answer to the question on the right side, because we have several yes answers and several no answers. And if you would do that on your own now and just think about it in one moment, if I would ask, okay, who would answer yes? I don't know if it's just because of your digit or because you use doping substances. That's the idea, to avoid this social desirability bias, and the math behind it we cut out for this presentation. I want to switch to my colleague Werner Pitsch, who will present the results for these RRT questions. And there you will see that we have the differences in honest yes, honest no, and he will explain that what this means in this specific method.
Thank you, Monika. Thank you, Cliff and Mike, for the nice presentation before. This was the method, and we used this method to be confident to approach the true score of dopers in recreational sport better than by directly asking, did you do something illegal? It's easier to answer this question honestly in the middle, because you are sure as a respondent that a yes answer cannot be traced back to your behavior. It can be because of a random process, and this is why we are confident that these data are better, and it has been shown in methodological studies that they are better than direct questioning. Okay, so let me switch to the results. We did not only ask for doping in recreational sport, we also asked for using over-the-counter medication for performance enhancement, so placing the concept of doping in a broader context of using maybe illegitimate substances or methods for performance enhancement. And we also asked for use of medication in the context of sport for other reasons than performance enhancement. So opening the perspective even wider to medication use for maybe painkillers or mood enhancers and things like that in the context of sport. So, oh, this was the wrong direction, sorry. So I will show you some slides with very similar pictures on it. You now see the first two bars for the question of over-the-counter medication for performance enhancement. This is the left bar, and the bar in the middle is for medication for other reasons than performance enhancement, and the red part of this bar is the estimate of honest yes answers. So you can translate that to honest dopers and honest users of over-the-counter medications who honestly say yes to that question. The green part is the part of honest no responders. It's the part of people honestly saying, no, I didn't use over-the-counter medication for performance enhancement. And the white part, and this is very special about this method, the white part is the part of persons who don't answer according to the instructions, who don't answer honestly to our questions. So what we can interpret is the size of the red bar, and what we can interpret is the size of the green bar, and about the others, we don't know anything. This can be seen as a disadvantage of this method, but we have to be clear that this is maybe also an advantage, because by direct questioning you also cannot be sure that people answer according to your instruction. And here we at least can show which part dared to answer honestly to these questions. What we see is that we have around 10% over-the-counter medication used for performance enhancement. And that shows to us that the idea of enhancing your performance by using substances is not a strange issue to recreational sport. There's a substantial part of recreational athletes who does that. And the other part, what we see is around 40% says honestly yes to medication use for other reasons than performance enhancement in the context of recreational sport. And that places the figure of doping, which I will present now, into a broader context. And what you see for doping, we have 0.4% of honest yes responses. And we have 91.1% of honest no responses. So having said that, we could simply finish the whole Fair Plus project by saying, okay, 0.4%, that's not that much. We don't care about it. But when we dig deeper into the figures and when we dig deeper into subgroups, we will find higher estimates for some subgroups and lower estimates for other subgroups. With these analyses, we build on knowledge we already have on doping in elite sport. What we find, for instance, in elite sport is a more or less stable difference between the two genders. And we did that analysis also for recreational sport. And what you see here, doping by sex, you see that on the left, in the left bar, you once again see the overall estimation, 0.4% overall. But you see a zero estimation of honest yes responses for female recreational athletes and a 3.1 estimate for male recreational athletes. What we also can interpret, 90.4% honestly says no. 90.4% of female recreational athletes honestly says no. So that means that by maximum 9.6% can be the upper level of doping in female recreational sport. But it's more or less closer to zero when we look for the honest no responses. Okay, so that means we have a pattern, we have found a pattern in recreational sport which is close to what we find in elite sport as well. And that motivated us to look further into the hypotheses which were developed for elite sport in the history of doping research in the last 20 years. And one very famous hypothesis concerning elite sport is the so-called vulnerability thesis from our colleague, from a philosopher from Norway, Sigmund Lolland. And in short words, he says, for any athletic performance goes that the higher significance of basic biomotor qualities, and basic biomotor qualities in this sense is speed, power, strength, endurance. The higher this significance and the lesser significance of technical or tactical skills, things which you have to learn, which you have to develop over years and which you have to automatize over years, the more vulnerable a performance becomes to doping. So more or less, you can boil that down to the more the lesser the number of factors which influence performance, and the closer they are to biomotor abilities, the more vulnerable the performance is to doping. This has been shown in elite sport to hold, because in elite sport we compared the so-called ZGS sports where you can measure performance in centimeters, grams, and seconds. So in physical units like track and field athletics, like triathlon, like rowing, or these sports, when you compare these sports to games, you have two classes of sports, one with more significance of biomotor abilities, of few biomotor abilities, and one with more complex structure of performance. Why don't we compare single sports to each other? You can imagine when you look at single sports, in elite sport, the figures very, very quickly boil down to very low figures, and you cannot. Okay. Does it still work? Okay. You cannot compare 5 track and field athletes to 5 football players or something like that. And the same holds for recreational sport, because with the RRT, you can imagine, with this randomization process, we need huge samples, and this is why we cannot compare single sports, but we can compare classes of sports. And we classified in recreational sport as well, CGS sports and games, and our hypothesis is that the prevalence of doping in CGS sports exceeds the prevalence in games. This is what has consistently been found in elite sport. And let's look at the distribution of sports in recreational sport. Here you see we have classified the sport into 5 classes: artistic sports, combat sports, games, CGS, and others. And when we compare this is the share of CGS sports. It's 56% among the recreational athletes, and this is the share of people playing games. It's 20% among recreational athletes. And when we compare the answers for doping, we get this result. We get a rate of honest yes responses in games of 6.5%, and a rate of honest yes responses in CGS sports of 0.5%. The total contradiction to our hypothesis, total contradictory to the vulnerability hypothesis. And this effect is significant. So that means it's statistically reliable, this effect. And that pointed us, it was the first point when we thought, maybe we have to think totally differently about doping in recreational sport than we did in the last years about doping in elite sport. If such a hypothesis, which seems very well founded and very plausible, and which has proven to hold in elite sport, does not hold in recreational sport, but holds in the contradictory direction, that's a strong contradiction to the hypothesis. So we had to rethink everything we thought about elite sport. And the first step into that was to look at what is the distribution of people competing and not competing in recreational sport. And we had asked our respondents, which sport do you do, and at which level of competition do you do your recreational sport. And you see the distribution here, and here at the bottom, here at the bottom you see these two bars with recreational athletes in games and in CGS sports who do not compete. And you see here for CGS sports, we have 47% who do not compete, who do not participate in formal competitions. But for games, we only have 17.9%, so around 18% who do not participate in formal competitions. What's that? These are people jogging through the forest, driving their bike by themselves, never riding against others, maybe riding in a group of close friends, but never competing formally. On the other hand, when you think about games, can you play a game without competing? Even if you do not participate in a formal competition, even if you play tennis against your best friend, you compete, because otherwise you can't play tennis. So competition is one inherent element of playing games, while it's not inherited in doing CGS sport. So this is one basic difference Because in elite sport, it's clear everybody competes. In recreational sport, this is very different. And when you look at the distribution here by the level of competition, we find even some people in recreational sport who say, I do my sport on a recreational level, who compete at an international level. These are very marginal sports, maybe some speed skating, or I don't know. I don't know many of the sports who were answered. There were about 250 different sports in the data set. But you see also we have in nearly all these levels, we have more people in games competing than in the CGS sports. And that makes clear that competing or not competing, taking part in or participating in formal competitions explain doping, the differences in the doping prevalence better than the difference between games and CGS sport. Okay, this was the first hypothesis, and digging into the explanation for the contradiction to our hypothesis in recreational sport was very, very interesting way we went until we found that. And then let's come to a second hypothesis, which I developed a few years ago to explain some prevalence data in elite sport. It's the idea of sport as a consumer capital. What is a consumer capital? Consumer capital goods are goods which, when consumed, lead to an increased stock of human capital to consume the good in the future. That sounds strange. It's not like buying shoes or buying a jacket, because then you reduce your capital. These are goods which increase your capital. And a good example for it is, remember your first tennis lesson. It wasn't that much fun, maybe, if you had one. Or remember your first hour of doing a new sport. Maybe it was not that much fun, but this hour of doing a new sport increased your human capital to consume that sport in the future. And with each hour more you spend on that sport, you increased your human capital to consume that sport. And not only consuming in terms of playing that sport, but also watching it on TV, discussing in the pub with your friends about that sport, if that was an offside or not, if that was a foul or not. You see, you increase your human capital by every hour you spend on playing a sport. That means, on the one side, with more hours you have spent on the sport, more years you have already spent on the sport, you increase your utility from doing that sport. But on the other side, if you play your sport in competitions and you do not compete successfully, the higher the loss is, the more you have already spent on the sport. So on the one side, your utility increases, but if you don't compete successfully, you lose more because you have already spent a lot of resources on it and you don't get the payoff from it. This has been shown to hold in elite sport. It has been shown in a mathematical simulation that it should also work in recreational sport, but has never been tested empirically. One of the hypotheses we can derive from that is the prevalence of doping will increase with the time a sport has been played. And it's not the absolute time, but it's the time relative to your lifetime. It's not about a certain number of years, but how much of your life have you already spent on the sport. And this is why we divided the sample into two halves. So the left bars are for half of the respondents who had played their sport up to 1/4 of their lifetime, because this was 1/4 was the figure which separated the whole sample in two equally sized parts. So it's the so-called median statistically. So the left is for the duration up to 1/4 of the lifetime, and the right is for the duration for more than 1/4 of lifetime. And you see, for those who have played the sport for longer, the rate of honest yes responses is 8%. For those who have played the sport not as long, the rate of honest yes responses is 0%. And although this difference is significant. So this shows that sport, in the sense of a consumer capital, can also provide helpful insights into the field of recreational sport, which we don't have in that depth so far. Okay, and now I will hand over to my friend Andrea Chirico from La Sapienza.
Okay, so one of the other purposes, objective of FAIR Plus, as you see, was also to investigate, just to go deeper and deeper. So we were the diggers team, let's say. We tried to dig behind the data. So besides the prevalence data, we try also to understand which were the psychological, psychosocial variables that can make sense of doping, of attitudes toward dopings in recreational sports. So besides just a single data of prevalence that my colleague just presented, we try to understand if there were some link between the prevalence data on the use of doping and some psychological variables or psychosocial variables. To do that, we try to, as we did for the prevalence data, we started from which is in the literature in elite sports, so which are the theoretical framework that try to understand the human behavior, okay, in elite sports, so the doping intention, the doping behavior. And we frame it, our second part of the research, with these three basic framework, theoretical framework. There's one of moral agency, that is about values. That is, we will see the concept more deeper in the next slides. The social cognitive theory, and the theory of planned behavior. So we took from these three framework and started to create in the same survey a second part of this survey, try to evaluate individual data, basically starting from this theory. There's a lot of literature that found different protective factors or risk factors for doping, but you know, this is just on elite sports, and there are very few data on recreational sports. So we can say that this is the first time we started to approach as a pan-European survey, both prevalence data and also psychosocial variables in this specific target. And from all the different variables and linked to that framing, to that regular frameworks, we define 4 key components that we will see now in details. The first one is the self-efficacy, then moral disengagement, moral identity, and attitudes toward doping. So the first one is the self-efficacy. It's based on the social cognitive theory from Bandura, and this in this specific concept in doping is used as self-regulatory efficacy. That means the conviction that people hold to resist to doping. Okay, so if you start to imagine measures that we use, is a sport-specific version of self-regulatory efficacy, and this is about how you really believe to say no in specific circumstances. Okay. The second key variable was moral disengagement, still from the social cognitive theory from Bandura, and moral disengagement are conceptualized as some certain mechanism that people use when they do bad things. Try to don't feel so guilty. A classical example in doping would be like, everybody does it, so why should I not do it? Or my doctor say I need to do that. No? So moving the responsibility out of your behavior or trying to share the responsibility. So these are kind of these are just a couple of mechanisms that are related to moral disengagement mechanism. And we use it also here, validated instruments, that is the moral disengagement scale. Moral identity was introduced in this survey because there is a lot of literature starting to deal with values. We know how VADA also is striving to put the values as a basic part of the education. So we decided to put the moral identity theoretical framework and the moral identity scale that we barely adapted to the sport context using the spirit of sports values. And actually the measure is asking people, how do you feel, how do you self-recognize your identity close to these values? So it's a positive, protective factor. And then the last one was attitudes toward doping, so which is a general attitudes of person towards a specific behavior or the use of substances. So do you find this useful? Do you find this right? Do you find this funny? So aptitudes toward doping. And the scale was the performance enhancement attitude scale. So we took these four scales, these four measures, and we collect the data all over Europe. So our first thing that we did was, let's try to imagine how different the cultures are, how the words are different in different cultures. So the first step was to understand if each of these measures measure the same things in all the different cultures, because we did translation and back translation. So this is called invariance in statistics. And I will not show results of invariance, but I can tell that invariance was fitting. So we had the same construct, the same comprehension of these items, wording, and scale in the different countries, in the different cultures. And the first part of the analysis that we'll show, we'll try to merge the data from prevalence with, that are data group-based data, with individual data. This is something that has never been done in literature, so we're trying to find also statistically, mathematically the right way. So our first explorative part was just to use the grouping variable that we choose starting from the elite sports for analyzing with RRT the prevalence. Let's use the same grouping variable in our psychosocial variables. And we found very small differences, but still significant. Self-efficacy and moral identity, as you can see, the two protective factors are higher in female. So it was completely aligned with RRT question. And same things, moral disengagement and attitudes toward doping that are risky factors. So people that answer positively in this are, let's say, more linked to intention to use doping. We have a significant higher moral disengagement for male, a significant higher attitudes toward doping for male. So we can say, oh, good. Even if you can see there are very small differences, we have 0.3, 0.4. But please remember that prevalence data are showing difference of 3%. So we expected also to have not so much big differences. So we moved on the second testing. It was about sport practices. So what's happening here? We use the same grouping variable and start to understand. We used we checked for the two protective factors, and we found actually that records, so CCS has a higher protective factor than games, and was significant. Why we didn't find any significant differences, more disengagement attitudes toward doping. So still here, aligned with RRT, we found the results, but there is something we should dig more and more. And it's probably about competitive level and so on. We used also to check for the results on the different competition level and on the duration, why didn't find any significant differences. And we're also thinking why, and we are speculating a little bit on the possible changing of psychosocial variables within life. That is not the same about measuring prevalence. This was the first step, and we're very satisfied about this. But the idea of the second purpose was also to understand the process and the mechanism, not only differences per se. So beside just analyzing differences through a path analysis, so another statistical methods, we try to see if there is some connection between all these variables and trying to understand which is the weight of each on explaining attitudes toward doping. So we did a path analysis model. And we linked the moral identity, the moral disengagement, and the self-regulatory efficacies and attitudes toward doping all together. We tested some different models. So we did competitive statistical models to understand which were the best fitting model. And we found this one that also linked to somehow the theory, because the theory says the moral identity is more conceptualized by Aquino, it's more a trait-based, a stable idea of the self, or the values. Then we have more beliefs, malleable beliefs, let's say, moral disengagement, and self-regulatory efficacy. And at the end, we put as last and closer, let's say, to doping behaviors, the attitudes toward doping. What we found is this moral identity didn't have any significant direct impact on attitudes toward doping. So the feeling that people has about their values are not directly explaining attitudes toward doping. So how I feel about which are my most important values related to sports are not directly related to attitudes toward doping, but this is called direct effect. The moral identity has an indirect effect through the other variables. So it means that alone, it will not have an effect, but together with the beliefs that are more malleable, like moral disengagement and self-regulatory efficacy, it will explain why people have positive attitudes toward doping or not. Okay? So people with higher moral disengagement will have higher attitudes toward doping. The numbers there are the weight of each path. People that has higher self-regulatory efficacy, so they say no, that they feel convinced to say no to doping, they protect. They have been protected by these beliefs from attitudes toward doping. There is a minus sign. And same things happen for the indirect effect that are a protective effect of moral identities on the use of attitudes toward doping. So why this is important? I think that we can just conclude with 3 points. The first one was about the first results, small but significant differences, still aligned with RRT. So there is space for a more deep statistical analysis to understand each different small group, how we can really merge this group, how we really can make understanding of the process and psychology besides prevalence. And this is why. Because as we see, moral aspect values still appears to be an important part of this process. And now we understand why all around the world literature starts to streaming with values. Because these are a key variables in explaining this. And why this is important for us. Research, it's nothing if it's only about theory, but we can transfer this data on the practice. Why? Because we know that moral aspects are important, the moral identity is important, but we can work not on moral identity because it was not directly linked, but on malleable beliefs. So it means that anti-doping intervention organization should focus on this variable. Besides we know prevalence, we need to know also how to act on that prevalence, how to prevent this prevalence, at least try. That model tries to explain where we should focus in terms of intervention, psychological intervention, to reduce attitudes toward doping and doping. So that was my little conclusion. Now I'll give the floor to Ask, that we're going to wrap up everything. Thank you, Ask.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. My name is Ask Vest Christiansen, and I'm from Aarhus University in Denmark, and I'll try just to wrap up. So if you've had a lapse during the last 40 minutes or so, it's not in vain, because we'll catch up now, and you'll see the summary of what we've been talking about. So first take-home message is perhaps that we should not panic about the situation with doping and recreational athletes. Our overall basic finding is that it is very few recreational athletes, at least in percentages, that use illegal drugs to enhance their performances. This, of course, doesn't mean that in numerical sense that they are that few, because still 0.5% of the total population of recreational athletes in Europe is still some people. And perhaps even more significant is that those people will more often be males than females. This is not totally surprising. Again, it mirrors our results from elite sport, but it also mirrors our understanding of sort of larger human behavior. We know that males are from evolutionary theory and the theory about human behavior, that men tend to take more risks than women do, and men tend to be more competitive than women are. So it's not that surprising. It matches those more larger findings as well. Furthermore, when we look into the idea of taking medication in connection with your sporting performance, that is, whereas there might be a rejection in general to taking illegal substances, the idea about using medicine in one's life to enhance one's performances, also in sport, is not it's not a very distant thought for recreational athletes. So we find that 1 in 10 would go down to the local pharmacy and get over-the-counter medications, for instance, in the form of painkillers or maybe caffeine, to enhance their performances either when they play sports on their own or when they take part in the local 10K run, because that just makes it more fun for them and they can increase their performance slightly. And this is the same for men and women in our findings. It's about 10% that use this over-the-counter medication. But furthermore, if we look at the use of medicine in general as part of or related to sporting, playing sport, doing sports, the use of medicine is actually quite common. It's around 40% who would reply in the affirmative that they are using medicine associated with their sport, but maybe not for enhancing their performance, but just to get out. If you have an aching back or your knee is hurting, then there are medications out there that can get you out playing football with your friends or going on a bike ride on a social club ride or something like that. So from our perspective, so one perspective of this could be, oh, it's terrible that people use medication to play sports, but a more positive interpretation could be, well, aren't we pretty lucky that there are remedies out there, so even if you have a hurting back or an aching knee, that it's possible to still be active, be physical active, and play sports with your friends and family and in the local club. So I don't think we should be necessarily too disturbed with these results. Now, then, if we looked into the hypotheses that were sort of driving our analysis here, we started out with mirroring the hypothesis from elite sport that Werner Pitsch told you about, namely that it is fruitful to divide sports into appropriate categories that have basic similarities. So therefore we had combat sports, we had aesthetic sports, we had games, and we had CGS sports, and the CGS was those sports that can be measured in centimeters and grams and seconds. So again, as Werner said, the hypothesis here would be that recreational sport mirrors elite sport, so we would find a higher prevalence in CGS sports than in the other sports. Now, at the end of the day, our results showed that we only had significant results for games and CGS sports. So those were the two that we looked into, and we found that when we looked at that, we would have to sort of test that hypothesis of vulnerability against two other hypotheses that we came up with, namely what role does competition play? The fact that you compete, or do you just exercise, so to speak? And the second, or that would be the third hypothesis, would be how, if you are embedded in your sport, if you've invested numerous years in that, and it perhaps becomes part of your identity that I'm a football player, or I'm a cyclist, I'm a skier, or whatever you are, how does that play in, and how does that relate to the risk of you taking doping or illegal substances? And as we heard, what we found was that we saw that the prevalence, when directly compared and looking first at the vulnerability thesis, we had this sort of contradictory finding that the prevalence was higher in games than it was in the centimeters, grams, and seconds sports, the measurable sports. And that sort of was a provoking finding in the first instance. But then we also found that the hypothesis about competition had more explanatory power here than the pure fact that the sport could be measured or not. So we found that the prevalence was higher when athletes compete rather than when they just exercise or are purely recreational. Lastly, we also showed that if you have invested time and perhaps identity in your sport for a longer time, then the risk of you being a doper is much higher than if you haven't played the sport. And even if our first finding was disturbing or surprising in a way, now when we put it up like this, it's not that surprising. Because if I invest in something, I also feel more inclined to succeed in it or have a good time doing it in a way. If I only played tennis once, I'm not that worried that I lose. But if I played tennis for 10 years or more, it's more likely that I feel it is important how I perform when and if I compete. So in that sense, our introduction of new hypothesis here means that in recreational sport, competition and the fact that you do compete is more useful, has more explanatory power than pure vulnerability and the fact that you can actually measure a sport by centimeters and grams and seconds. Competition is a more important factor here. Also, the fact that how long you've invested, how much identity, how much time you invested in the sport has more explanatory power than vulnerability to pure biomechanical or biomedical factors behind it. So that also means that might be important for those who are in the applied world, where you have to sort of do interventions and come up with programs. But it also matters for our colleagues, researchers in this field, that we should be careful of just taking what has the explanatory power in elite sport and just adopting that one-to-one into recreational sport. We have to think about our subpopulations and how are they exposed to those elements about time, identity invested, the element of competition, and so forth, as they might have more explanatory power than just the classical vulnerability thesis. So that to us, our finding here is actually quite a significant step forward in our understanding of what doping and use of medicine in recreational sport is. I think we have better understanding now than we did 3 years ago. Lastly, relating to the psychological scales that we invested, we remember that we saw a higher prevalence among men than we did among women, and we found that those protective factors that we see that, for instance, with higher self-efficacy, we found a higher rate of that among the women. On the other hand, those that are the risk factors, like moral disengagement, we found that to be higher among men than among women. And also with the positive attitudes to doping. Really, positive attitudes perhaps is not the best word, but it's just a lack of negative attitudes to doping. But to express it more clearly, it's the positive attitudes. And lastly, we found that self-efficacy or self-regulatory efficacy is slightly higher in athletes playing the CGS sports compared to those playing the games. So these were the findings from the technical expert group 1 from the last 3 years, and thank you all for listening.
When we did the run through of that, I challenged them to finish in 50 minutes, on the nail. Beautifully done. So we're going to go to a little coffee break now for around about 10 minutes. I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts. You're going to start the questions. So a couple of thoughts. We didn't touch on the problem of the definition of recreational athletes. In philosophical terms, we call this the Sorites paradox. When is a heap a heap? You know, if you've got 1 grain of sand, it's not a heap. You know, if you've got 10,000, it's a heap. Right, tell me at what precise point it becomes a heap then? Nobody knows. It's a relatively arbitrary judgment about practice. So how are we going to arrive at that? I know that TEG 2 are going to mention the definition, but that's a problem for all of us in this room. Second point, I'd really like to hear something about moral identity and athletic identity. Because it seems to me there's something interesting going on there. There's sets of data that don't easily sit with each other. The third thing which doesn't easily sit is this huge literature in the 70s, 80s, 90s about moral development and its gendered basis. Because there's lots of stuff in anti-doping about male dominance in doping and so forth, male competitiveness, male aggression, blah, 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 blah. And yet you seem to be saying something a little bit different. In the great theories of Lawrence Kohlberg, men and boys were more morally developed than women and girls. A bizarre finding, which broadly went along the lines of, well, men and boys care more about justice, women and girls care more about care and the nestedness of relationships. Yeah? So you're not saying that at all. You're saying something quite different, in fact. So I'm quite interested in that. I'm also interested, Werner and Monika. You can focus on the green and you can focus on the red, but you've got to say something about the white too. And this uncertain figure looked to be around 10%, and if you ask most people working in anti-doping in elite sport, give us a rough figure of what you think is the doping estimate. A lot of people say 10%. Now, you can't say that because you just don't know about that 10%, but it is somewhere 8, 9, 10 in lots of different questions. So that might be something we want to dive into. But the floor's yours, not mine. I'm just stirring the pot. That's my job. Thank you very much for groundbreaking stuff, and that survey is a huge survey, right? So you've given the world of anti-doping, public health, and sport a lot of things to think about there. Thank you very much. Can we show our appreciation? And I'll see you in 10 minutes. I'm going to open the floor straight away because we have around about 15 minutes of Q&A discussion time. Who'd like to start the questioning?
Thank you. My name's Simon Hitchcock and I'm from UK Anti-Doping. The question I had is it possible to delve deeper into the stats for specific sports in order to get more of a view of prevalence, but also looking at the data in terms of how long an individual's been engaged in the sport as well, thinking of differences in terms of competition ages of sports.
Okay, Monika or Werner, who wants it?
So, okay, thank you for the question. We had overall around 7,000 respondents. And after data quality management, we ended up with around 5,000 for the RRT questions. But when you boil that down to single sports, the figures reduce dramatically. So there will be, by maximum, there will be something like football all over Europe, which we will be able to analyze. But we will not be able to compare football to any other sport and what is a figure without a reference to that figure. And that's the point why we use this method, which is already has been developed for elite sport and which has provided good results, good explanations for elite sport and recreational sport, so CGS sport and games. And even on that level, we cannot analyze for single artistic sports and for single combat sports. You understand? So this is a limitation of the RRT, but we have to accept that when we want to approach the true score of honest yes responders. Thank you.
Monika.
So that's for the RRT question and the case, so we can dig into how long do people play their sports. These data are there in a descriptive level, but the prevalence data, that's the problem with the sample size there.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question.
Thank you very much. You already stole my question. It's about the definitions. You mentioned the definition of recreational athlete. I will not touch that, but I'd rather would like to know if the respondents were aware actually what you mean by prohibited substances, doping substances. Did they know that it includes marijuana, cocaine, and anabolic steroids?
Thank you very much.
I can take that one. Is the microphone on? Yeah? Okay, good. So that is a critical question, and we've seen that in doping studies the last 25 years, that do the respondents understand the same thing about the concept of doping as the researchers do. So there are different ways of handling that problem. One is to give examples. By doping we mean, and then you list 10 substances, for instance. You could also say by doping we mean, and then refer to the World Anti-Doping Agency's definition, which is 2.1 to 2.10, and it's pretty complicated judicial document to read. But by doing that, you already, if we have a method that is complicated enough to understand, and the more instructions you put into your survey, the bigger the risk for people to fall off is. So at the end of the day, we decided to go what you could call with a social scientific definition, namely to ask people what they self-identified as prohibited drugs for their sport. The disadvantage with that, of course, is that they may identify, say, painkillers or caffeine as doping, while it's not. But on the plus side is that what they identify is something they know to be morally problematic. So they identify own behavior that might be problematic in a way where they know they transgress a moral line or a judicial line. So in that sense, the self-identification of what doping is good if you want to understand moral behavior that is dishonest in a way. So that's why we went with that idea of the respondents themselves defining what they thought to be prohibited substances.
Thank you very much. Liene, do you want to come back on that? Or are you happy? Yeah, as a kind of research response, I suppose a practitioner way of saying that might be, do we just use the prohibited code? I mean, is that the relevant tool? I mean, it's the obvious tool, but is it the relevant tool? And that's going to raise a whole catalogue of further questions, especially if, as I think we'll discuss this afternoon, the NARDO extension in scope into recreational level sports as opposed to when the code was originally designed. So that's going to be an interesting question, I think, this afternoon. Erik. Thank you.
Thanks. Erik Duiven, Doping Authority Netherlands, and also member of the Tech 2. Just a slight observation looking at the results is, I think especially for Andrea, if you look at the competition and the level of competition, when it increases, there's more risk of doping use. For me, looking from a sports psychology background, I'm straight away thinking about internal motivation, external motivation, goal orientation, stuff like that. Is there anything in there, or am I just making no sense?
Thank you, Erik. Yes, what you're saying is a great insight, let's say, because when we speak about motivation, we think about self-determination theory, so the difference between internal and external regulation and motivation, or achievement goal theory, so how people are oriented when they compete, about beating others or just beating themselves, their limits, let's say. That could be a very insightful, let's say, perspective for the future. We didn't choose to go deep in this, first of all, because we really tried to make this survey as simple and as short as possible. Because after the people answered to the RRT question, there was not one, but as you see, 3 RRT questions there is a cognitive load anyway when you answer some survey. They had to answer then to other 20 items of my scales. And we fought a lot in deciding how short should be my questionnaire, because normally, psychologists do 100 items questionnaires. And then I was very disappointed, but I was happy because they are my friends, and then we found an agreement. And we put just only 4 scales, short scales. But yes, definitely this was my first idea also in check for this. And this would be a little bit problematic only because level of competition is so mixed and is so difficult to understand within the definition of recreational sports. So at the end, we need to find just an agreement with these young guys here.
Okay, we've time for a final question.
Thank you, guys, for your presentation. It was really, really insightful. I'm Dr. Luke Cox, a postdoctoral researcher at KU Leuven. And my PhD actually focused on doping at recreational level Welsh rugby, where anecdotal evidence suggests that there is high rates of use. Anti-doping sanctions document this as well. And some of my participants were very clear in the fact that they were using these substances for body image, but they were very well aware that these substances could also increase performance as well. So are we able to separate between these motivations, and should or does that matter? Thank you.
So that's a kind of doping in recreational sport rather than doping for recreational sport question. Who's going to take that?
So thank you for the question. We cannot, you say some respondents said that, and you can imagine that we cannot separate these objectives on the population level, because at the population level we have thousands of people doing jogging or cycling for leisure, and few rugby athletes, very few, and very few athletes in similar sports, maybe American football or something like that, where we could assume similar patterns. That's the one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that we asked for using prohibited substances for image enhancement, and with a sample of recreational athletes from whatever sport, from the whole span from downhill skiing in winter to doing yoga in a gym, you can imagine that, we found that this question does not work for this broad span of recreational sport. So the figures were totally weird. That is the one point, and the other point is that we received questions from respondents, from well-educated respondents, from sports scientists, from friends from us, who asked, what is using prohibited substances for image enhancement? Do you think about using Botox or whatever? So the idea of image enhancement for somebody who identifies himself as, for instance, cross-country skier, can imagine this is far away from his world of what you can do with substances. So it's for sure it's a topic in sports like rugby, maybe in sports like American football. It will for sure be a topic in the gym when it's all about bodybuilding and these issues, but it's not a topic in this broad sense of recreational sport in whatever form it is done by so many different people, so many different groups, so many different ages, and so on.
And if I can add just a little part of my background, I really think that besides trying to categorize sometimes drugs or behavior or motivation, there are some theories, there is some literatures about, for example, drive for thinness or drive for muscularity. There are some strong prediction of the use of something, and at least more than understanding what substance you're using for what, seeing if there are some beliefs, some predictors of the use of substances. That if it's a drive for muscularity, you will understand the link easily between competition and a sort of internal beliefs.
Last word to ask.
Well, yeah, just finally, so when you ask, can we separate those motives? Another way of replying to that is that when we ask, did you knowingly use prohibited substance in your sport to enhance your performance? Then it again, as I said before, it's up to the individual respondent to identify or to analyze did those substances I used, did I use them to enhance my performance in my sport, or was it purely for aesthetic reasons? And in them replying to the question, there is a separation in the motives. So it's up to that rugby player to define whether he did it for aesthetic purposes or performance enhancing purposes. And then, of course, there are someone where the jury is still out.
Doesn't that also rather depend on the method? I mean, this might expose the limitation of questionnaire methods, where you can drive deeper and further into these nuances in qualitative research. Monika, the last word?
I don't want to add, that's what Ask said I wanted to add, but your point, that's also one point I made yesterday. Sometimes we don't know it's clear for the athletes themselves. If we try to separate their motivations, but sometimes is it clear for them? Maybe we don't know clearly, because a substance could affect both, but sometimes it's really clear I use that because of this or that. Sometimes it's clear because of performance enhancement, and sometimes could be a side effect, whatever, and okay, I take that side effect with me, but I'm not so clear about my motivation. That could also be a fact, and I don't think that we have research on that topic, and qualitative research should be done in this field, in my opinion.
Well, on your behalf then, can I thank you? I'm sorry it's such a short Q&A. We just started to gather a bit of momentum there, but that's the way these things go. So on your behalf, may I thank what I think is just a groundbreaking piece of research. We really know a lot more about this sphere now than we did when we started 2 years ago, but also you seem to have set a lot of, we say hairs, but you've set a lot of balls rolling in different directions on the basis of this. So I sincerely hope this agenda now drives forward in a serious way. So thank you very much indeed. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. April Henning. She's a lecturer in sport at the University of Stirling in Scotland. She has a PhD in sociology and has published widely on issues related to doping, anti-doping policy and gender. Her latest book is Doping, A Sporting History, published just this year by Reaction Books. So hot off the press, we have April. And April, you have only 15 minutes to add your dimension to this topic. So the floor's yours.
So hello, my name is April Henning, and as I'm beginning to speak, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm really happy to speak with you today, and I am very sorry for not making it in person, but as Mike just alluded to, it turns out that rail strikes on both ends and a lack of flights makes getting to Brussels really, really difficult. So thank you to the organizers for the invitation and for accommodating the distance with this virtual option. I'd also really like to start by congratulating the researchers and the technical expert groups who carried out the two main fair projects. These projects on this scale during a pandemic is an incredible feat, and I hope you all feel very proud of your work and the findings that you've produced. Now, the findings not only give us some insights into doping among recreational athletes in Europe and about anti-doping education delivery, but they also extend and inform the debate on this topic. Now, crucially for me, because I get to talk about it, is that they've also provided the foundation for future researchers to sort of pick up this research baton and seek out some answers to the next questions. And I think we can agree that this report leads to many new questions. Now, some of what I'm going to talk about will have begun to be asked and answered in the presentations this morning and a bit in the Q&A. So, forgive me if I'm going over some things that we've maybe already discussed. But let's go ahead and get into this. Okay, so what did the findings of this huge piece of work tell us? Well, quite a bit, actually. But crucially, there are a few further questions that do require more research. And from my reading of the final report, there are four main sort of high-level things that I'm going to talk about for further discussion. Now, the first is this prevalence figure and the prevalence of doping among recreational athletes, and that it was reported to be so low. Second is that this report reveals the complexity of enhancement in sport at this level. Third is that there is a huge diversity in anti-doping education across Europe in terms of both content and delivery. And then finally, I'm going to discuss how this report reveals the lack of evaluation of these anti-doping educational programs. So are these findings a surprise, any of them? Or are these sort of new answers leading to the same old questions? Well, let's see. So let's start with the prevalence findings and some methodological questions. So this 1% prevalence rate is sort of right in the ballpark of the official statistics from WADA's own testing programs. And these have been mostly stable, if we can generalize, with around 1% to 2% of samples coming back as adverse analytical findings. But we also know from research, including some that are using similar indirect survey methods as this project, that athletes do tend to admit to doping at far higher than the estimated rates at the elite levels of sport, including reports as wide as 14% up to that sort of infamous now 57%. But those are elite athletes, and those studies are generally conducted on elites, and they may have different motivations, different risk-reward calculations than those who are at the recreational level. So what about studies of other recreational athletes? Well, those in the room will be familiar with a study of US amateur cyclists that found much higher estimates of doping using the same RRT technique, particularly among sort of middle-aged or older males. But maybe America is different because this is focused on Europe. Well, a 2016 study, again, by some of the research team, found that recreational athletes in Germany, 4% of those reported use in the last year. So what might explain some of these differences? It might be an aspect of the method or methodology. Now, I am a qualitative researcher, and I have full confidence in my colleagues who carried out the analysis and modeling in this study. I trust their work, but I have taken an RRT survey myself, and it is a bit complicated. So perhaps this method is a bit complex for participants, and this led to some skewing of the results if they were unclear what they were meant to do, something like that. Now, as we've just sort of had a bit of discussion about, the report also notes that the participants were asked to rely on sort of their own understanding or their own definition of doping. Now, previous research tells us that doping definitions can vary quite widely, but in terms of WADA or NATO's and the code, the actual substances on the prohibited list are the key ones. Now, that doesn't mean that the results would have necessarily changed if the legal definition of doping had been provided, because many wouldn't even recognize a substance from the list that they were using if it was in front of them. And you don't need to know that you're using a prohibited substance or actually even intend to use it to be considered doping under the code. But given that the second key finding around using medication for enhancement did seem to come through as a bit of an issue, there may be some overlap that could be clarified by clarifying the definition for the participants using that in the WADA code. Because as some of my undergraduate students have put it this term, the code doesn't care. It's just about whether you have or haven't. Now, this leads to some, newish routes of inquiry for future researchers. So first is this question of definition. So how well do respondents understand the code definition of doping? How well do people actually comprehend what we're talking about when we're asking them questions about their doping use? The next one is about this survey method. Is the RRT too complicated for participants, or is there some way that we could potentially simplify this? And finally, this question around prevalence, is 1% an improvement, or is this a regression? Now, this question is going to come back as I continue to go, but sort of let's keep this in mind around this idea of, what does this 1% actually mean? Now, the first half of the report also revealed a lot about the complexity of enhancement taking place among recreational athletes, particularly that finding that 10% of respondents had used over-the-counter medications for enhancement. Okay, now bearing in mind that only 1% reported doping and that no definition of doping was given, a whole swath of recreational athletes think pursuing enhancement is fine as long as they don't cross into what they think of as doping. Now, of course, there are some flaws in that logic. As I've mentioned, strict liability tells us that intent and even understanding of doping really don't matter if you do test positive. We also know from the research that some proportion of adverse analytical findings and anti-doping rule violations will be the result of unintended ingestion. And one study has estimated that this could be historically up to about 40%. And in such cases, these common sense definitions of doping, or the sociocultural, as we might think of it, definitions of doping, or even, potentially anti-doping education that's based on values rather than on these specific rules, might actually land athletes in a bit of trouble. Now, the related finding that medications were being used by about half the participants for non-enhancement against this sort of the backdrop of this 10% enhancement and 1% doping rate raises questions of how we actually approach doping and enhancement. Now, there have been lots of calls by researchers, and I include myself in this, that perhaps we should take a more public health-based approach to enhancement rather than one that is punitive. But then this raises further questions, because how do we actually define such an issue? Is this sort of gets to that philosophical question that Mike was alluding to just before the break? You know, is 1% sufficient to be a public health problem? Is 10% use of medications for enhancement a problem for public health? Or is the problem actually that intentional doping that actually only applied to athletes or can only apply to athletes? Or is it the enhancement itself that's the problem? And then who decides all of this? Now, this becomes even more muddled when we look at the broader picture of enhancement and how wellness and sort of being one's best and constantly working towards that is a highly held social value. So, you know, our store shelves are often full of various powders and pills that are designed to improve our health or appearance. And that doesn't even begin to help us understand how to navigate, you know, this sort of multiple clashing policies, because as we know, sport and particularly anti-doping don't get to regulate what's on store shelves or sold in a pharmacy in any country. So there is this question of where would we even begin with this sort of approach? Now, some of the questions that this part of the research leaves us with are, you know, what non-doping medications are being used for enhancement and why? So we now know that this is going on. We know that this is intended to enhance. So what exactly are people using and why are they doing it? Now, does intent to enhance matter, even with it's in the rules? Or are those sport values that we hear so much about so important that this actually is a problem for sport? This sort of enhancement without intent to dope. And then, you know, third is, you know, do these findings constitute a public health issue around enhancement or doping or both or none of the above? So again, you know, lots and lots of questions coming out of this, just this first part of the report. Now, the second half of the report provided us with some new insights into anti-doping education, particularly with regard to the diversity of educational provision in terms of form, content, and resource. Now, in the case of the latter, researchers and anti-doping officials have focused years of research and development on anti-doping education. So, you know, completing these education programs is often a requirement for athletes to participate on squads or in events. But, you know, despite this, it seems pretty clear that we still haven't found a comprehensive way of educating sports stakeholders about anti-doping, nor even what is the best focus of that education. Now, given the expertise in both pedagogy and anti-doping available across Europe by those who engage with sport, this is perhaps surprising that a workable model seems to have gone unidentified and then, you know, once it is identified, shared across countries. Now, of course, this study focused on a particular type of education, or that was targeted at athlete support personnel. Now, the focus of this study is kind of interesting, given that the FAIR project is specifically for recreational athletes who may or may not have as much in the way of an entourage or support staff in the way that we think of it at the elite level, or that those at the recreational level, and a large number of whom in that sector we know are volunteers, are cognizant of or knowledgeable about doping, or that it's even a topic of discussion. And while, you know, I think we can all agree that it's never a bad thing to educate, targeting athlete support personnel is interesting. It's a choice. And would this be more efficient to target athletes themselves at this level? But this might be
April, I'm going to ask you to come to a conclusion the next minute if I can, please.
Oh, gosh. Okay. So let's just sort of skip ahead here to sort of the final slide here. So new questions. If we educate and then survey, will the prevalence numbers move? Second, what motivates non-doping enhancement behaviors? Third, how are we determining success in anti-doping education? What are the metrics? What are we actually out for? And then fourth, what are the standard measures that are needed to evaluate anti-doping education?
Well, you took me at my word, didn't you? Yeah, fantastic. April, can I thank you for a really detailed response to this survey? You've done a fantastic job. Allow me just to say one thing to the audience who may not be academics. I mean, the form of respect that is adopted in academic life is to try your very best to hammer the thesis that you've just been given to read. And you've just seen, I think, a friendly critical approach. So I'm going to give the last word before we go to lunch to allow a response. But that's a really, really detailed critique. And some of the things that you've picked up there resonate with this morning, but they also anticipate what we're going to cover this afternoon. So that was a really, really fabulous intervention. Thank you very much, April. I hope you're able to join us and maybe drop an email or something over lunch if there's some things that you really want to be pursued, because you can't do it offline, and we'll try our best to include those in the afternoon discussion. But many, many thanks indeed. That was a super response.
No problem.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to go on to our last speaker for this morning, Liene Kozlovska. She's Senior Program Manager in the Anti-Doping Unit of the Sport Division at the Council of Europe. Dr. Kozlovska has been involved in anti-doping activities since 1994. Now, that doesn't mean she was doping since 1994, of course, but she's been engaged in anti-doping activities since that time, when she began coordinating the Latvian anti-doping program. And in the meantime, she completed her studies and is a certified sports medicine doctor. Congratulations. So you bring together quite a perspective, but also the Council of Europe as another crucial political entity in the anti-doping scene. You'll give us different insights from what we've heard so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting the Council of Europe and allowing to speak at this very timely conference for us, very selfishly saying so, but you will understand it at the end of my presentation. But it is really a topical issue now for the governmental sport policy makers as well. And I'm very sorry for the previous speaker that she couldn't complete the really important part of her analysis of the education methods. And I think maybe somehow in the afternoon session we can reach out and see the findings for the rest of the presentation, because I took a lot of note from the ideas that were already outlined. When I was saying that the recreational doping is now on the agenda of sport policies in the European space, it's not just nice words. I can verify it, and this is included in the European Sports Charter. And I have a noise. Is that okay? Or yeah? All right. So I continue, but bear with me if I'm a bit nervous because of that sound. So the revised Sport Charter is something that advises all European governments how to organize their sport policy framework and how to ensure that all citizens have rights to access to sport and have a possibility to use all the benefits of sport. And one of the words that I highlighted here is that the states should protect the participants. And when you are in sport and you use medication, you are not really protected if you don't know why you use it. So there is a duty for the states to make sure that people, if they do something, they know what they are doing. And as I said, that sport is one of the fundamental rights in this sport charter, and this protection of sport environment means also that people, when they do sport, they improve health, not opposite, that because of use of medication together with physical load, they destroy their bodies. And That's going maybe even beyond doping definition. It also goes into the entire over-the-counter product use and also our favorite subject, food supplements, and especially food supplements from unknown sources that are contaminated and they may contain God knows what. And we have acknowledged since 1989 that public authorities should help sports organizations and work in protecting sport from doping threats. That's one of the key articles of our convention. We ask that the states parties have legislation, procedures, and processes to make sure that doping is not available. But most importantly, we ask that all people doing sport, they are informed about what health harms and what what threat to the values of sport doping will pose if such practices are used by people in their adult age, but more importantly in young age when they don't really know what it's all about. So this is our past. So since 1989, but I am not only talking about ancient past. I'm talking about things that happened 2 weeks ago in Turkey. In Antalya, there was the latest edition of the Conference of European Sports Ministers. It was held for the 17th time. And one of the key findings or key commitments of that conference is that sport is good, that sport can be used for many social benefits, but at the same time sport should be carried out in a safe manner, as I previously said when quoting the sports charter. And here in one of the resolutions, it's clearly said what has been found in also in your study, that doping and use of substances in connection with sport is a threat to public health. So this we can use as a reference for any further initiatives that, at least at this level, European sports ministers agreed that, to that, and that we need to focus more on doping at grassroots and recreational sport, because we know that international sport federations, International Olympic Committee, Paralympic Committee, focuses a lot on elite sport, about those who are participating in international level, but less work is done for those who are competing at the ground level of sport. In parallel to that, the European Union earlier this year, I think it was, this summer, well, time flies so fast, announced the sport initiative, Healthy Lifestyle for All initiative, and invited the organizations, states, individuals to pledge to implement actions to support this initiative. And the Council of Europe bravely, remembering 1989 convention, but also more recent commitments through the political documents, agreed to look into a dangerous area, very murky from what we hear already from the definition side, to see how we can raise awareness of health risks this time for those who are involved in non-competitive sport. And again, asterisks to amateur, asterisks to recreational, because definitions is something that we have probably to start with. The idea is that we want to address those who will never be tested, first of all, and then as a consequence will never have anti-doping education. And we are in a beginning, because the commitment starts from 1st December, so we are a couple of weeks to start it. And here's my plea to you. We are in a bit of a political standstill for our anti-doping convention, and that's why we are using this forum to call for volunteers to join our Council of Europe's working group directly to the Secretariat, because the anti-doping convention is not having any meetings for the time being. So we would like to invite, if anybody is interested, to join a project group, and there we will start from scratch to see what resources we can use, what conclusions we can draw from existing information, what are the good practices, what are the gaps that we can close by recommending things to the states parties at the governmental level. So that's our plea, and very much appreciating your work already done, and it goes very well in the direction where we want to move next year. I also promise I can say that we will be very much willing to share the results and see if you will be lucky and have a 7th edition of Forum. But that's something that we can discuss sometime for the next step. So thank you very much, and good luck to the afternoon session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liene. I think what we've seen there is a call for collaboration. Yep. We had a challenge, or a series of challenges indeed, from April. I think we should just ask the team, do one of you wish to just stand up and give a 1-minute response to what you've just heard from our two speakers? Or is that too much to do? If you're happy, why don't you give a 1-minute response?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, thanks. Both April, if you're still with us, and for the presentation here. First, perhaps let me just address the last slide you had, where you said that part of the process is to look into the legislation and what previously has been done. Let me just allude to the previous report we did that was published 3 years ago, which has an extensive overview of what rules and regulations are in place in anti-doping throughout Europe, and the one before that looked into what the individual anti-doping organizations actually have. So I think there you will find them as valuable resources for your projects, so you don't have to do the whole thing once again, because these are valuable resources for that. And perhaps a brief comment to April regarding the educational part. We talked about that last night as well, on Veda's approach to this with Tony Cunningham, and I think here again we have to understand what we mean about education in specific contexts and how we deal with that. I think it is worth addressing when we talk about the intent to dope or not intent to dope that we looked into, rather than pushing athletes into a situation where they may test positive. The fact of the matter is that it is only a very, very small minority of European recreational athletes that will ever be tested. So our approach in our study was rather to understand whether they think they are doing something illegal, rather than if they actually are doing something that's, whether they are doing something that's illegal. So I don't think it definitely is a risk. Also with the food supplements that you say that there might be a risk for contamination and then test positive, but for the majority of recreational athletes, it isn't that big a problem because they are simply not tested.
What I think we've all seen is this is maybe the end of the FAIR Plus project. It's not the end of this topic. It's clearly there's so many answers yet to be even touched. So I think it's great that we've had the research to the policy, back to the practice, and the two speakers who've responded, you've created a perfect bridge for us this afternoon. So thank you very much, and our great thanks to the research team too. Without without further ado, let's shift gears a little bit. Now, what we're not going to do is we're not going to move from research straight to practice, because the TEG 2 is a combination of research-informed practice. So again, we've got this kind of multi-method approach to solving a particular range of really pressing questions about doping in recreational sport. And I'm going to just welcome online one of our speakers, Dr. Mike Petru, the president of the Cyprus NADA, who unfortunately is unable to join us today. But Mike has been with us right from the beginning of this venture and has contributed enormously to the work that's been done over the last decade. So, Mike, we're very sorry not to see you here. I'm sure you're with us in spirit, and I hope you're with us online as well. So I'm going to hand over to Fredrik first. So, Fredrik, I'll allow you to introduce yourself, but Director of Science at the Norwegian Anti-Doping Organization, and Erik Duiven, Head of Education from the Dutch Anti-Doping Authority. We're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. And this is the whole team. So in addition to Erik and myself, Michael Petru from the Anti-Doping Organization of Cyprus that couldn't be here with us today. And also, along these 3 years, we have gotten a lot of help from a team of researchers from Leeds Beckett University, headed by Susan Backhouse, Dr. Laurie Patterson, and Dr. Helen Staff. They have been particularly involved with study 2, which I will get back to shortly. And also Professor Lambros Lasouras from Sheffield Hallam University with the last part of our project. So these are the aims of the technical group 2. It was to provide a framework of principles and guidelines on how to set up anti-doping educational programs for coaches and related professionals in recreational sport, but also how to monitor and evaluate the effects of these programs. The definition has been discussed before. I don't know whether you have seen it, but this is the definition we have used for the whole FAIR Plus project. It is from the 2019 report. I think you can read it yourself. And as you can see, it's quite wide and includes different sport disciplines and athletes participating in sport on different levels. And this has also, of course, affected how we have designed the guidelines because it's so wide. We will get back to that later. So the timeline of our project, to be able to develop guidelines, we needed more insight into the current practices, successes, failures of current programs in Europe. So we did a survey, mapping survey. About 100 organizations were invited to participate in the study. NADOs, they were the biggest group, but also international federations and other sport organizations. Then, based on findings from the mapping survey, we did some individual interviews with some stakeholders particularly involved in this area. And Erik will tell about that later. And finally, we did focus group expert interviews. And that was the basis of the guidelines that we will present here to you today. So let's jump into some brief findings from survey number 1. And you'll find all the details in the report, but I will give you some bits here about the most important findings. So European NATOs, they were the biggest and most important group for us. So 36 European NATOs were invited to participate in the survey, online survey, and 34 responded. So a very high response rate. So that will be the focus of the results here. 27 of those reported that they did provide or had provided in the last 5 years programs for this group. So for coaches, trainers, and instructors within recreational sport. And they were also given the definition, of course, so they knew what to respond and which group we wanted to know more about. So what kind of results did they provide for us? First, we looked into what kind of education activities were provided. And here you can see the most frequent education activities. I think almost all of them provided face-to-face group sessions. Many provided print media, and then fewer e-learning and so on. So most organizations focus on traditional learning methods, and we also found that this was during the pandemic. Not all were actually suited to deliver education in a pandemic situation where you cannot meet persons. So e-learning, mobile-based apps, not that common. So what about the topics? They were given a range of alternatives, and they had to reply whether they included those topics or not. We can see that the most frequent topics, which are risks of unintentional doping, consequences of doping, prohibited substances and methods, and risk factors associated with doping, are also interested and relevant for elite athletes, as well as recreational athletes. But then we also found that many of the other topics may not be that relevant for this group of coaches and athletes. Topics mostly related to the World Anti-Doping Code, such as use of medications and TUE, anti-doping rules and regulations, testing procedures, the principle of strict liability. And as has been said before, very few of these athletes are tested on a regular basis, so why would they need to know about TUEs? Whistleblowing and the doping control process. So the topics were not really tailored to the group. And also, maybe the topics most important for this group, how to create a positive, safe, clean training and sport environment, were not that common. Only a few organizations included those topics in their programs. Another very important and interesting finding was regarding evaluations. Only 12 of 27 NATOs that had programs had evaluated their programs. And even fewer had reported the conclusions of those evaluations. And we found that the means of reporting was often internal reports, so it was not publicly available for other stakeholders to look into and learn from. Only one organization had published their results in a peer-reviewed scientific journal as a scientific paper. Then Erik will tell you more about the interviews.
Thanks, Fredrik. Yep, so step 2 of the 3-phase study was the individual interviews, because with the surveys you get like a scan of the landscape, but you don't get the in-depth information that you want, and you want to check if everything that you see is also correct, because it's a self-assessment report, so you want to check that. So the goal here was that we said we want to do interviews, but we want to do the interviews with, let's say, the best of the best. So the ones that have programs for this specific group in recreational sport, also the ones that said that they did evaluate their program and preferably also reported the evaluation in some way or form. So those were the organizations that we really targeted. We ended up with a slightly bigger group, and we interviewed them with the goal to see if there were key areas for policy interventions. So that was what we did. And the interviews were focused on 3 different aspects. So the key features of the anti-doping education programs. So actually what is done, And then the aspects of education program, development, implementation, and evaluation. So what did you do to develop this program? And then what did you do to really implement it? And in the end, evaluate it. And then the third step was looking to the future. Okay, now we know this, where should we go to? Because in the end, we want to write guidelines and we want to inform policy to see where we need to go to. So, main outcomes of this part of the three-phased study is that recreational athletes is a very broad term. We talked about definitions here, and this is just what we see coming back with the interviews. There were three big groups that the different organizations were focusing on. So one is the gym and fitness centers. The second one is school environments, which is a really different group to focus on. And the third one is coaches at non-elite level. So coaches within recreational sport, but far broader than just the gyms, but all recreational sports. And in the end, what we get is a very patchy landscape. So you have different organizations that work within their own setting, trying to figure out how to do the work, where to focus on. And they use what Fredrik showed, multiple methods. And there's a variety in activities that they provide. So there's not like one line that we can see here or one approach that we say, well, this is the best practice. Actually, all the organizations are trying to figure out within their own setting the best way to move forward. But what we do see is that what Fredrik also showed is that most provide face-to-face learning. And also, most of them have online methods. This can be e-learning, it can be online seminars, but some form of online education takes place. So that's what we see throughout all the organizations and programs. And there seems to be some consistency in the topics that are covered, but strangely enough, the WADA framework is used here for those topics. And again, there's some repetition here because we wanted to understand what we saw in the survey, if that's correct or not. But we see that the topics that they use are from the International Standard for Education and come from the code. But it's probably not the best fit for this group. But it's the first step to take because a lot of them have experience within elite sport and then try to take the next step and try to focus their energy on the recreational sphere as well. So the actions for having such programs, they are driven by three different things. So first of all, global policy. So for instance, what we hear a lot is we have the World Anti-Doping Code, and in the code there's a reference to recreational athletes. And that means that a lot of those organizations say, okay, we need to do something for recreational athletes, and then also for the ASP, the support personnel around that group. So that's one. The other thing is there can be some national policy or national legislation. For instance, here in Belgium, there's national legislation that is also looking at the recreational athletes. And then sometimes the organizations themselves say, well, there's a real public health interest here. We think there's a health risk, something needs to be done here, and we as an organization feel the responsibility to act in this field. So they focus on recreational sport as well. So these are the three different action things that drive the action. Then when we look at the development and implementation, what we do see is that the organization that really have those programs, it's not a surprise, but they can allocate some resources to this group. So it's an extra group. It's outside of the first groups that they need to reach, and then they say, okay, we are able to do something more. And then they also get the support from external organizations. They don't decide on themselves, so there's some policy, there's some force driving it, so they have those programs. All of them are very knowledgeable and skilled at educating. So you know that the education itself is of a high level. It's good, professional people within that organization. But those professionals, they know there's a need for tailoring. They know that their program is not the best fit at the moment. Yeah, so they want to tailor it, but to tailor it, because of the diversity, there's a lot of things that you need to consider. That takes a lot of time, and they are not there yet. So they only manage to do that to a limited degree. So that could be something that can be improved over time to have a much more tailored program. And then if you look at the evaluation that they reported, well, during the interviews, we saw that most of the evaluation is not actually evaluation, but it's monitoring of what they do, what they see in the level of knowledge that they can bring across, and whether or not the participants are happy with the program. But there's no in-depth evaluation. There's no real evaluation process going on. So this is for us really a main outcome. If we want to improve this field, we need better evaluation of what's going on, especially because there's no one fix for all. So that was basically step 2. Moving into step 3, the formation of the guidelines. And we actually struggled because we said, okay, we are 3 persons from NADO's, National Anti-Doping Organizations, but we need to get consensus in those guidelines. It can't be that the technical expert group decides for itself, these are the guidelines for the whole community. That can be that it's just the focus from the National Anti-Doping Organizations, so there's needs to be more. So we asked Lambros Lazarus, the professor at Sheffield Hallam University, to assist us. How do we do this? And we decided to have focus group interviews. And we said, well, the Leeds Beckett University had a big stake in all of the first steps. Let's ask their advice as well, give some input to start the focus group interviews, and in the end, come back to WADA and ask feedback. Okay, this is what we see. Is it in line with what you see as well? Can we move forward with this? So that's what we did. And then we decided to have focus group interviews on 3 different groups. So the NADOs, the academics, and the non-NADO organizations. So that's the organizations that do, mainly from a public health perspective, do some work in this field. And then we had the interviews. Professor Lambros Lazarus led those interviews, and then we saw, after content analysis, that there were a few main things that gave us input for the guidelines. So first of all, how is the development, monitoring, and evaluation of the anti-doping education programs taking place? What's going on? The second one is, can we identify the relevant organizations? Who is within that landscape? Who are the organizations that we need to address? Can we indicate the professional target groups, the different groups that we have that deliver or who are the trainer, coaches, and instructors in this field? And then identify the most relevant topics, because we saw that the current topics are not the best fit for the group. So that's what we did, and now we go back to Fredrik for the last bit.
Thanks, Erik. There was quite a challenge, actually, to develop the guidelines, because I think we, in the beginning, expected that it would be more resources out there and practices to build the guidelines on. But as long as the process went on, we were able to gather some new insights as well. So as you remember, the definition is quite wide, so the guidelines, they will have to be general enough, so it applies for different groups, but still specific enough to be useful. So we will present some guidelines here today, but the full guidelines is a comprehensive document that you will find in the FAIR report. So where to begin? It was very clear from all the expert groups that NATOs, they should take the lead, and they play an important role in developing, providing, and also evaluating education for these groups. But they should establish collaboration with other stakeholders, such as sport federations, sport clubs, international federations, the fitness industry, educational providers, coaching federations, and so on. Both to develop, but also how to communicate, promote, and so on. And also fundamental knowledge was important in all the discussions we had with the experts. But the knowledge will have to be tailored to this group because there's no one-size-fits-all in this context. That's very important. We should provide education both pre-service, maybe already when they go through their education, higher education, but also in service, continued learning, and so on, to keep it fresh. Blended learning, both traditional knowledge-based face-to-face group sessions, e-learning, bit-sized learning, scenario-based learning, case studies, reports, was important. And also embedded into other topics, because that's often the challenge, to have the time to also provide education in anti-doping, because there's so much else that's also important. See whether you can embed that into other topics in sport. Sport for all, sport should be fun, health aspects, and so on. And these are the topics that should be covered for coaches, instructors, and trainers within recreational sport. So principle and values associated with clean sport, but maybe not the fairness focus, maybe the health focus is more important. Sport for all, joy, substances and methods. I think it's easy to use the prohibited list, but maybe not the full list. At least some substances are also used among recreational athletes. Supplement use is always relevant and of high interest to this group. High-risk situations, what role these coaches actually have to make them aware of their responsibilities. How to promote a clean sport environment, which we saw from the mapping study wasn't actually part of many of the education programs. It was focused on the negative aspects of doping use and not how to promote a positive clean sport environment, which is important. And also risks and protective factors of doping use in recreational sport. And lastly, and very important, the main finding in all our work is the one about evaluation. Because there's so many examples within anti-doping that organizations, they invent the wheel over and over instead of building on experiences, successes, failures of others. Because there's really no way to go to find and share these practices and experiences. So NATOs, they should evaluate their programs, and these evaluations should be made publicly available, which is very important. And we also know that it can be difficult for NATOs to begin an evaluation project, you need, that's also some special expertise you need to do that. But to partner with relevant academics, research institutions, and so on, would be very useful. Yeah. And make it available. I think that's the clue here. So others can learn from your mistakes and what works and what does not. So this is the guidelines, at least some of them.
Thank you very much. Let's show our appreciation for the Take Two group. Thanks a lot. We have about 15 minutes for discussion. I'll give you a start of a 10 if nobody else is going to join in. Okay. The NARDO respondents said NARDOs should deliver the education. What do the other populations say? Now that's an interesting question, because what we've heard is the groups are so heterogeneous. So let's just ask a simple logistical question. As a research team and as an operating team, you cover Scandinavian country, a Northwestern European country, a Southern European country. Could you decide among the three of you who to reach out to as the recreational athlete population?
So with limited resources, for us, it's about try to figure out where you can have the most impact. Don't do everything. Try to focus. Try to see where you can find the support. But also, and I would like to refer to WADA and what they did with looking at their own organization. Say, okay, we don't need to do everything ourselves. What we can do is also be an enabler. We can look in our environment and see what organizations we expect what from. So we build the system instead of do everything ourselves, try to reach people that we can't reach easily. So get together with, for instance, where do these coaches come from? What education do they follow? Can we go to those schools and see what their role is, how they can facilitate and have a collaborative approach? So mapping out what's going on in your own system, find the areas that you can have the most impact.
Yeah, so what we saw from the expert group interviews, it was that all the groups pointed at the NATOs, not only the NATOs themselves, because the NATOs are already doing the work. Most of them focus on other groups, but as we saw from the mapping study, 27 of the 34 NATOs that responded in Europe are already active in the field of recreational sport. And they want to succeed, but I think they need some help on how to make it more relevant and tailored to the group. To make the education measures more effective.
Yeah, I think there's a range of questions in there, aren't there? And one of the ones which was raised by the Flemish NARDO in conversation last night was who gets to do the delivery? And the head of education says, well, I'm the same age as you, the 7th decade of my life. Have I got any relevance for these messages? So is it about how you deliver, but also who delivers? Have you any views on that? Do we want more septuagenarians or sextuagenarians actually delivering? Because wisdom comes at the end of the day. You want all these smart people to give all these good messages about what a good, healthy, well-balanced engagement is. But of course, I have no relevance to these 13, 14, 15, 20-year-olds who get different tones, use different media, different messages.
Yeah, and I think that's why the approaching coaches could be smart, because then you teach the teachers, and they can bring on your message to their athletes, because they are important role models in their environments. And also, if you succeed, you will get some ambassadors for clean sport, because this is a huge group. All people active in recreational sport. I think it's impossible for NATOs to reach out to all of them. But if you go through coaches, teachers, so on, and they can use your message on their athletes.
It'd be interesting to see how that ties in with what we've found earlier from some of these results here about how you would say, well, maybe it's the CGS people, or maybe actually no, forget that. Let's go to recreational level and look at the survey. Maybe it's the games players rather than the CGS players. So ask first.
You emphasized the need to evaluate what has been done, and I mean, to begin with, it sounds like a no-brainer that of course we should evaluate, but it also when you say it, it's also because we haven't done so yet, and you found out how and to what extent and so on. But then the next step after the no-brainer that we should evaluate is how should we evaluate, and what does it mean to evaluate in this context? Because if the evaluation should be fruitful for others to look into, they need to know in what ways and how, because in evaluation there's also an element of measuring impact in some way. So what are you, just some thoughts of how is there any recommendations on how to evaluate after recommending evaluating?
So any kind of evaluation is better than no evaluation. And also the experts, they pointed out that you can do evaluation is a big term, and the effect evaluation is quite difficult to achieve. But you can also evaluate learning outcomes and do qualitative stuff, speak with the target groups, how they experience the education progress and so on. So I think it's a lot of things you can do. But when you have done the evaluation, you should make the conclusions available for others. And of course, the ultimate goal is to get it published, but that can be difficult. So maybe not set the highest standard from the beginning, but write a report, get it out there, get comments, and you can build on that.
Yeah, and to add to that, for most organizations, doing evaluation takes away resources to deliver the program. And then they say, well, we much rather deliver the program. But then if you invest like 10 years in delivering a program, but you don't know what the outcome is, you should allocate some time for the evaluation. And most of them, it's a scary area, because there's no real good examples of how to do that. And that's why we say, okay, work together with people that do know how to do that. So go to the academics, ask them, okay, can you help us out? Because we invest a lot of money. Also go to your funders and say, I want to do this evaluation, but I need some extra funding to see what the impact is. Because then I can make solid improvements and it will save your time, or I will increase my impact with the same amount of money. So it's worth the investment. And this all sounds like no-brainers, but if we look in the field, everyone is waiting for others. And what we saw is just start. Make it small, whatever you do, publish it or get it out there just as a report or whatever, share it internally with the group of colleagues that you know, but at least do something that we can build this system, because there is no system for this.
And maybe WADA in NATO can be a hub for that, to collect all these reports and share it with the stakeholders. That would be...
Okay, Liene.
Thank you. I hope it's on. Yeah, the Council of Europe, we are traditionally collecting information from all the 52 states parties of the Anti-Doping Convention, and anti-doping education questions are always on the list. And I have a bit of skepticism about the reality behind the 27 NATO's performing recreational education programs on recreational athletes. Because we do also evaluation visits on spot, and when we speak to NATOs, they all, almost all, say that they have no resources to do that. It's not their main target, and it's all, as Erik said, it has to be done on top of everything else, if time permits, except of a few countries where it's really a part of public health policy. So my question is, do you see recreational doping as part of NATO, or it is somebody else to do and NATO can help?
I can begin, and Erik, you can follow. Just your remark about the 27 NATOs, reporting that they provide programs. I think you're completely right, because when we examine the organizations further in the individual interviews, it wasn't always easy to replicate the findings from the mapping survey. It's probably easier to tick the box, but when you are challenged to describe it in more detail, it's in some cases not that much there. So I think you're right, but also the NATOs, they vary a lot when it comes to focus on these areas and also resources. So you'll find the whole spectrum, I think.
Yeah, and then regarding the question whether the NATO should do this, what we did with all steps is that each and every time they come back to the NATOs, they say they are key in this whole area. So yes, I do think there's a role for NATOs, but I think that most NATOs operate from a framework within organized, structured sport and anti-doping within that system, so the WADA framework. And that's where you see that things go a little bit wrong, is that now you have to do something outside of that scope. And then it's like, okay, are we allowed to do that? Is there support to do that? Who do we need to work with? That's another group. We don't know the whole system there. So it's really, it starts with mapping out where are you within this whole environment, and then see, okay, how can I have the most influence? But it comes back to the NATOs. If they all say that, I think that there must be some truth in that.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to our next speaker, or questioner.
Hi guys, yeah, thanks again for that. It was really, really good. I have a question with regards to some of the delivery of the educational material, and you identified that that was through schools or in schools. So I was just wondering whether we could perhaps propose that anti-doping education becomes part of school curricula, and perhaps that could be a recommendation if we are all in agreement that doping is wrong. Thank you. Should it?
Yeah, so the topic should be in school curricula, but it's part of a larger thing. So doping for elite sports is really important that they get education about that specific topic. What we see here in recreational sport is that it's embedded in all kinds of other things. So look at sports integrity as a whole, and doping is a part of that. Look at health as a whole group, and then look at doping. So it needs to have a place, but it doesn't need to have a specific course. It can be embedded in other things that are already happening.
I can't help thinking that everybody will, like Liene's suggestion, think, how do I do this? So the physical education teachers are going to go, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm already too busy. How do I do this? And do I really want to be doing a classroom-based education rather than more physical activity? So that tension's going to come out. So I think the resource issue's got to be really pushed quite hard. I want you to think a little bit beyond the survey now in the next question, because everybody's going to agree with you when they say, A, recreational athletics or sport is a heterogeneous activity, one that's ill-defined, but is composed up by lots of different kinds of demographics. So when you say we need it to be tailored, there's some obvious kind of candidates. You say, well, it needs to be age level or educational level tailored, or does it need to be gender level? Does it need to be CGS level or competitive game level? Or, and here's the one for you now, here's the tough one for you. Because if Mike was there now, Mike Petru from Cyprus, it's the law, right? So are you wanting in other European countries to extend the law down to recreational, to take this heavy apparatus, the anti-doping code, and put it into public life beyond the elite sphere? Now, I can see a bit of kickback here. So how are you thinking about tailoring it? Because if it's the law, maybe you do need to spend more time on the code or TUEs. So tell us a little bit more about how you think tailoring would happen.
Yeah, because this group is so heterogeneous and wide, it's difficult to get to give one answer. There are definitely sport-specific needs, so each sport will have to be met differently. And maybe it's possible to group them like Tag 1 did. So there are some common identificators within ball and team games sport, for example, and CGS sports. When it comes to legislation, there are already some countries where use is prohibited. So, but that differs a lot between countries.
Yeah, the tailoring needs to be at every level. So at the policy level, at the legislation, at the organizations that you have there, everything that's already going on. Yes, there needs to be tailoring in the groups that you want to reach. But I think the tailoring here is also about the whole structure and tailor what you do within that structure.
We've got time for one more question, I think. So, Andrea, to you.
Thank you. And thank you guys for the excellent job. And I have a question about the content of the intervention, because I'm very curious about how you arrived to the categories where you asked them to select which were the content most used, because I've seen there a lot of knowledge things and learning stuff, you know, and things that pop up in my mind when I see these things is, as sometimes I say, knowledge is not about attitudes or prevention, you know. And I make all the time the example of the cigarette box where it's written that if you smoke, you will die. But even if it's there, the knowledge is there. People smokes. So how you arrive to that kind of categories for the content, if anything came out in terms of predictors, values, and as a, let's say, ad credit union between recreational elite and all different levels and all different coaches.
Yeah, the list of categories could be as long as, you know, very long. So if I remember correctly, it was a consensus in the FAIR projects with your comments, along with other comments.
3 years ago.
But I think it's interesting to see that the most common topics are about providing information, which we know that may be not that effective, and that's an important finding. I think you have to change the focus a bit. Yeah.
Well, that's the next big project, as far as I can see it. How do you tailor educational messages? That's a huge topic. But we'll call a halt to this session now. Thank you very much, both to you and also to Mike online. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, everybody. Thank you very much for allowing me to shepherd you back so quickly. It's a great pleasure to introduce our keynote for this afternoon. It's Tony Cunningham. He's a senior manager at WADA for education, policy and research. He's been working at WADA now for 10 years and very well qualified to give this talk. He has a background in sports science, but he has also a master's degree in applied social sciences, and also he's a graduate of the Olympic program, MEMOS. So he really has a sort of all-round perspective, and the work that Amanda Hudson and Tony have done in the last few years has really massively put education into the map of WADA priorities, I would say, because everybody knew that you couldn't test your way out of the doping problem. Everybody knew that. But that didn't stop all the resources going there since the beginning of WADA. There's clearly been a sea change, I think, and you've been at the heart of that with Amanda. So thank you very much for making the time. We've had 2 great talks in Leuven already from Tony, so you're on a hat trick. Good luck.
It is a great privilege to be here, and as I said, thank you for the very generous introduction. I think there'd be probably too many people to name if we were to start talking about the people that have contributed to education over the last number of years. But it's, as I said, a great privilege to be here. Particularly, I guess I'm used to getting up for these forums at 4 a.m. in Montreal, so it is actually nice to be here as at an appropriate time, because I have really enjoyed all 6 forums. They all weren't online at different points, but the ones that were, it was a real insight. And it was great to actually see from year to year the progress of each of the working groups and to see the project finally come to a culmination at this point. I also really appreciated the sharing of other research projects and the platforming of other research projects that was going on. And I guess a highlight for me was one of the recreational athletes actually shared an experience of a positive test, and it really kind of highlighted that everything that we're doing and everything that we talk about policy and we talk about practice and research, it all seems really abstract. But there are real world consequences, and I really appreciated that talk in particular. I think it was last year, maybe the year before, but yeah, it was definitely something that was nice to see. I was asked to give this talk, and my first question when I got on with Erik, Mike, Werner and Cliff was, I don't think you have the right person for this to talk to this. So they convinced me that they talked to me about the brief, and I said, well, okay, I can share some experiences. And maybe that's what I look to do today, is to look at this idea of research, policy, and practice that everyone is talking about. And just to signpost where I'm going a little bit, when we talk about research, policy, and practice, it's quite, again, an abstract term about what we're all trying to do. So I'm not saying I've solved it or WADA has solved it, but just kind of some of the experiences that we have. And when we talk about aligning research, policy, and practice towards a purpose, the first area we would probably look to start is, well, what is the purpose? Can we all agree on that purpose? And that's where I look to start. And then, as I said, I'll look at WADA's angle or WADA's perspective, particularly from the education side. And then I'll look to break up each of those areas and just share some insights or some comments from myself individually at the policy, practice, and then research. And then, of course, all of that is all fine. It's important that we're always relating back to the real world and the context within which we're based. To start, we talk about WADA, where we're based, where we're coming from. The vision, the idea of athletes participating in a doping-free sport environment. There's maybe a couple of things to unpack there. One of the things is athletes. It's quite a malleable definition within inside the code, and this has come up a bit, not just today, but I've seen it over the years, is what is an athlete, particularly when you start trying to describe what a recreational athlete is. It's quite, seems to be a flexible term. We talk about doping-free sport environment. WADA, World Anti-Doping Agency. So there's a lot of work and talk about wider language about clean sport, about sport integrity. But the framework, obviously, that we've been assigned in the remit is anti-doping and doping-free. That doesn't mean that there's some crossover or some integration in other areas, particularly when we get into recreational sport and we talk about wider health implications for that. Our main mission, obviously, around the code, making sure that that's harmonized, adopted, and our stakeholders and signatories are compliant with that. But the part of the code that maybe a lot of people skip over and go straight to usually what's most relevant to them is at the beginning. And it says the fundamental purpose to protect athletes, promote health, fairness, equality for athletes worldwide. So that allows quite a broad family of stakeholders to be involved in some way. So recreational sport, recreational athletes do have a place. But there's probably a more nuanced discussion is we're talking about the World Anti-Doping Program framework. There's also 2 other frameworks with international instruments, the UNESCO Convention and the European Convention. So it might necessarily be that the answer to everything in relation to recreational sport is situated within the World Anti-Doping Program. There are other avenues. Rather than trying to force a square peg into a round hole, there are other solutions and other ways and perspectives to look at this. So the idea around this research, policy, and practice, in order to kind of further frame what I'm talking about, is from WADA's perspective. And this idea of research, policy, and practice coming together is quite a complex discussion, and it's something that has become more important and more prominent in different areas. So what I'll talk about is, from our perspective in the education side, is our research. We have a social science research strategy that we hope will inform policy. And we have seen that in the past, as we have the code, we have the international standard for education. And then how does that feed into practice, where we've developed the international standard for education guidelines, and say, how does that then ultimately impact or inform athletes being protected, athletes behaving in a way that's in line with their values? So that feeds down when we talk about policy. And the alignment, I guess I'll start there, is that from the code, there's been a really nice strategic planning process that was done in WADA over the last number of years, and it allowed a real reflection on what WADA's role is. And it's clear within that that WADA wasn't, I guess, able to do everything for everyone. And that really then informed us in the education department to be able to take a step back. And Erik mentioned it there before about the idea of us being an enabler. Because if we set policy, we become a regulator, because we have to determine whether our stakeholders, whether our signatories are compliant with the rules that have been set. But the other side of that is that if the rules are set for everybody, how do we support people to achieve those rules and regulations? And that, in turn, allowed us to structure the education department. When I say under the dynamic stewardship of Amanda Hudson, when we come in, we've had a standalone education department since 2019. And because we have that policy structure in place, we're able to then look and say, well, can we align our activities, our operations, to us being a regulator? And then can we also make sure that the activities that we're doing and the operations are enabling and leveraging and supporting our stakeholders in some way? So that's why you see we have 4 pillars to the education department, of 4 kind of teams that are there. My responsibility is for policy and standards and social science research. And what this allowed us to do is to kind of remove ourselves from being a delivery agency, or at least the expectation or the perception of us as being a deliverer. So that's very much over to our stakeholders. Say they're the ones that should be in front of the athletes. They're the ones that should be thinking about developing an education plan. They're the ones that should be training educators and ultimately making sure that athletes have the required information, that they have the required skills and competencies to behave in the way that they should be doing. So when we take a more step back, so I hope that just kind of frames where I'm coming from, where I'm situated, and where I'm talking from. But then we take a step back and we say, really, the importance of policy. Because I can talk to a time before education was situated as strongly as it is now within the World Anti-Doping Program. And everyone would talk about education as being number one. We have to educate athletes. Every time there was a positive test, every time there was a controversial scandal, we have to educate, we have to educate. But then you look at, well, what are people doing? Well, they're testing. They're testing, they're testing, they're testing. That's where all the resources were going. And then the more you test, and without education, there's obviously increases the risk of inadvertent doping, obviously increases the risk of finding athletes that are intentionally doping, but that begets more resources because you have a results management process. You have to look at different ways to make sure that that's resourced. So without a policy framework or cornerstone, people will talk about rhetorically the importance of something. And we never want to be making sure that everyone has to do something because they have to do it, or they do stuff because they have to do it. But without at least that potential of a stick being there, not a lot of stuff gets done. So it was very nice to, when I saw this updated graph coming in, and to see education take its place alongside all the other international standards. It was a really nice moment. It was quite a journey to get to that point. We discussed this a little bit last night. There's people in this room that will know exactly the journey that was going on to get us there. Because initially, having another international standard was not something that was seen as the solution. How do you standardize education? Well, you can't. So it was particularly nice to see that there, because there was obviously and legitimately questioning and critiquing of putting education up there. So in order to do that, and to bring us and navigate us into this, because we had to find a way to put education into the existing policy framework. We couldn't invent a new policy framework. So when we say you can't standardize education, that was our starting point of, well, if you can't make it the same rules for everyone else, how do you come up with a standard that is adaptable? We've heard a lot about tailoring. So how do you work from that basis? Particularly when you look at all of the other standards, it's very much linear. You know, you have a testing process that's the same. You have a TUE, therapeutic use exemptions. If an athlete wants to take a medication, there's a linear process. It's based on protocols. This has to be done. The athlete has to have the same testing experience no matter where they are in the world. If we were to mandate that everyone has to have the exact same education experience, that athletes in Asia have to have the exact same experience as athletes in Latin America, I don't think we would have seen education up here. So this was our starting point, is we can't standardize education, but we need an international standard for education. And I guess my favorite analogy for this, and I put up there the flaw of averages, is related to, actually in the 1950s, the American Air Force had a big problem. A lot of their planes kept crashing, and they couldn't figure out why. And they figured out that all of the instruments were not located correctly for the pilots. So their solution was, let's measure 4,000 pilots, get the length of their arms, the length from their ears, from their ears to their eyes, the length of their legs, shins, everything. So they took all the anthropometric measures and said, let's set the seats on the planes for the average pilot. Crashes went up because there was not one average pilot out of the whole 4,000 that they measured. So what was their solution? And the solution was, and we've all benefited from today when we get into our cars, is that you make the seats adjustable. And it's up to the pilot to decide what is the most appropriate and comfortable method for them. So this is kind of the approach that we had to take for that. So if we said we can't mandate, so where do we start? Well, can we start where everyone agrees on things? And you say, well, what are our founding principles for education? Where do we go? So we managed to come up with a number of these across, so a lot of consultation through Education Committee, through Council of Europe, through a number of different forums, and say, well, where can we all find that consensus? Well, the first one is, athletes start in sport clean. Up until then, or in a way, because of the birth of anti-doping in a crisis, the whole system is set up on the premise that athletes are going to cheat, and we have to catch them. But no matter if that is the case, all athletes will start in sport clean. So maybe let's focus on keeping them that way rather than waiting for them to do something and then try and catch them. The other principle that we managed to get agreement on is that if you can test an athlete, and if you can put urine in a bottle and send it to a lab that's accredited, that has a robust testing process and run a results management process, well then surely you can educate someone before that happens. And this is especially the case when we think about international level athletes. If your first experience is with an international doping control officer, the system has failed. And you think about how difficult that is for a young athlete to maybe competing internationally for the first time. Someone comes up to them in a foreign language and is trying to explain to them that they want them to pee in front of them and put it in a bottle, and they're going to take that away. So again, that would be something that we agreed we should work towards. Tailored education, I really don't need to go into this because it's been covered a lot, and the need for this. Something that maybe I'll go into a little bit more detail is the principle of cooperation. There's limited resources within the system. We don't need people falling over each other doing the same thing when there's lots of gaps that can be filled. So who does what? And can we get people talking and sharing? That was one of the things that came up in the last talk. Proportionate. And this, I guess, speaks to the graphic beforehand about different people have different abilities to do different things. So if we're going to be able to hold someone account for, because we have such a diverse range of anti-doping organizations. So how can we make it that everyone is able to meet the policy? And then, of course, something that was greatly lacking within the education field is educators, people with education backgrounds. If you have doping control officers that have been trained, surely we can train educators and making sure that they're following good and informed by good pedagogy. So that all has to translate into something that is tangible at the end. And this was the challenge, is how do we take principles and put them into something that you can hold people accountable for? So the first thing we needed to do was speak the same language. So if we're talking about education, what we discovered is that education meant different things to different people. So we defined what it was, we defined what an educator was, we defined the elements of education. It was mentioned again in the previous discussion about information. That was previously seen, give someone information, that's education. That's not education. It's a lot more multidimensional than that. So you build in, we need to make people aware, we need to make sure they're informed, we need to make sure that they're trained in a way that's in line with what they're supposed to do in terms of anti-doping education. And this should all be informed by values-based education as well. Again, quite an opaque area when we were talking about this, is values-based education was widely used, but not necessarily understood in the same way. And then the third section of the ISC was around roles and responsibilities. Again, who does what? And I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail. So that sets the policy framework. So as I said, it almost gave us a really strong basis on which to work. So we would see, I guess, policy as being a fundamental part of any system. If we're talking about policy, practice, and research, the absence of really any one creates a particular problem. But really, policy is the one that gives you the impetus, it gives you the platform, it gives you the place in which to build on. So what we wanted to do then is kind of paint that picture of, well, what does practice look like? And I'm not talking about, there's many different layers to all of these topics that I'm talking about, practice and the technical area of education. But one of the key things that we wanted to do was paint a picture of who does what. And where do we start? We start with the athlete and the athlete pathway, which is on the left-hand side here. And what we're looking to do is, can we match who predominantly should be responsible for educating athletes all along this pathway? So from children in school sport all the way up to international level athlete. And what you'll see represented here as well is the recreational side. We have these transparent boxes that are there. We have recreational athletes, and then at the bottom, at the base, physical activity, fitness. So although recreational athletes are defined in the code, in the education side, we had just further stratified them into two more distinct areas. One, recreational athletes being in a more formal structure, and physical activity, fitness, more informal. That's everyone just out exercising, doing what they can. And what we look to do then at each stage is, under the code, who should be responsible, or under the convention. So we see, what you might see here is that the NATO and RADOs, regional anti-doping organizations, are primarily responsible up until the athletes start to go internationally and compete internationally. Something that came up before is about who does what, who should be delivering. what is very clearly specified then in the international standard is that NATOs are the authority on education at national level. So this doesn't mean that they have to be the ones delivering. It means that they should be involved in some way. Some national federations have a lot more resources than NATOs, but that doesn't mean that that national federation should be going off in the absence of any input at all from that national anti-doping organization. The NATOs are the experts in anti-doping within each country, and we wanted to make sure that that was well reflected in the standard. And then once you get to the international level, then it's clear international federations have a clear remit about international level athletes or major event organizers. But that doesn't mean that in this practice structure that everyone can't work together in some way. So for example, international federations can mandate, or they are supposed to mandate, national federations to educate their athletes. So the interesting thing about how the policy-informed practice in this case is that we have lots of anecdotal stories now about the challenges of engaging national federations if you're a NATO. They're like, we don't have any resources, go away, we can't, anti-doping is not a priority, we have competitions to run, we have all of this, we have that. So it was interesting is that the international federations who then sent out a communication, and in some cases CC'd the NATO, and said, you must educate. So suddenly it flipped around, and where you're trying to convince someone to do something to knocking on the door and saying, you have to do this, I can help you with that. So it becomes a very different dynamic, it becomes a very different relationship. But before, without that policy, this doesn't inform the practice. So then we look, where does research come in? I don't have to advocate to anyone here, I think, about the value of research, but it's something that can get lost in the mix. And it's something, when we talk about evidence-informed policy, evidence-informed practice, again, it's another term that's used a lot. And if we're talking about a virtuous cycle, sometimes what gets missed is the disconnect between the research and both of those. But some of the disconnect can sometimes come from research not being connected in a way that we can say practice-informed research. Can we have policy-informed research? So you're starting from the point when we talk about the purpose is what is the purpose of what we're trying to do? Protect athletes, support athletes. The policy, does that align to that? Does the practice align to that? Well, then the research should also have a starting point of the purpose, whereas sometimes that's not always the case. Thank you. So no need to read all of this, just to illustrate for a few things, is the idea of generating research, or the idea of research, I guess, is to generate knowledge, to produce knowledge. And if you're a researcher, surely you want your knowledge to be used or taken up in some way. This is now part of my own study and research. This is something that Sue Backhouse sent me, and it really resonated with me because it looks to take the perspective of farmers and understand where are they getting their information. And the reason it kind of resonated with me is because I come from a rural part of Ireland, and I had an image in my head of the farmer at the back who was always threatening to shoot my dog for chasing his cattle. And I could just imagine this idea of where he's getting his information, and it's not coming from official sources. The pub, you're right, Mike. I could just more see him sitting on a bar stool getting his information from other farmers. That's exactly where it is. But if we set up a system to say, well, we're going to target these farmers through all these experts, and we're going to send them policy documents, and they're going to do that. And I could imagine this farmer saying, taking a shotgun that he was threatening my dog with to the policy document. And where you see as well on the left-hand side is what's nice about this study is the degree of trust. And where you look at who's trusted, the furthest ones away are the government employees. So then you look, well, where does the knowledge get to the farmer? And where is it coming from? It's coming from other farmers. Where are those other farmers getting their information? You start looking at where that knowledge pathway is. So then we can start saying, well, who are we thinking about? We're thinking about athletes. Should I go in a suit and start talking to athletes about the importance of clean sport? Well, where are they getting their information from? We know they're getting their information from coaches. We know they're getting their messages from other athletes. So how do we tap in, or how do we hack into that pathway in order to make sure that the right messages are coming through and they're receiving the right education? So this is the area I'm looking at myself. I mentioned Sue Backhouse there. I'm doing a professional doctorate at Leeds Beckett right now, and it's in this area of research impact. This is what I want to be when I grow up, is a research impact professional. Is the idea of if you generate research, how is that research having some impact in the real world? So the first part that I wanted to look at, well, what's happening right now? I'll talk through what we call a pathway to impact. And this is something that has come through a lot, particularly from funding organizations. They will ask, well, what's your impact going to be? And it came up as well, you just said, how do you measure impact? How do you define what it is really? And what we've seen when we look back at, say, the WADA research program, is you start off with, we have the grant program, we have a call for proposals, we choose a research project, we say, go, the research project, the researcher and the research team conduct the research process. Then the next part is, this says transfer, is the researcher gives us a 100-page, a 200-page, or a 300-page report, and we say, thank you very much. We put it on our website, and we say, best of luck to everyone, and try and translate that yourselves, or try and use that yourselves. So you see there's gaps at each stage of this where there's potential for to fall down, and there's nowhere where anyone's job it is to make sure that this is happening. And this is a big challenge, and it's a real difficulty for me, because I'm trying to make sure that this is coming along all the way. And it can be difficult when researchers are really keen to get their research developed and into the right hands, and capacity is very limited within the thing we've talked about, resources. So the impact is there in different ways. We're able to document anecdotally, at least for now. Like, for example, in the new code, I can trace some very clear articles, or I can trace some very clear concepts to the research, but it's not being documented. And this is often called the knowledge mobilization process. So we want to make sure that when we're talking about research, and we're talking about evidence-informed policy, evidence-informed practice, we need something to mobilize this knowledge. And this is where I'm at the minute, and it's a fluid framework, is the idea of a dynamic pathway to impact. And what this looks to do is it takes a partnership approach, and this is informed by the knowledge exchange literature. And what we're looking at is, can we get the people who are going to potentially use the research at the end of the process, can we get them involved at the start? Can we get them being partners? So the FAIR project is a really nice example of that, is that you have practitioners, researchers working together saying, this is what we need, and then maybe either side saying, no, we're telling you what you need, you don't need that, you don't know what you don't know, and it creates that healthy tension. So at each part of the research process, there's a release valve, is to say, well, are we on the right track? Is this meeting your needs? So again, the FAIR Forum each year, I guess it provides a nice milestone to see, are we on track? And the important part, I guess, is the next stage for the FAIR project is dissemination, is, well, how does this now take on a life of its own? And one of the challenges that we have with WADA, and something that maybe will come into this model at a later point, is the role of the funder, is how do we take a more proactive approach in requiring practitioners and researchers to work together for a means that we have. We have research priorities. Are our research priorities being met from this process? So we want to always make sure that it's going towards what we would call a bigger level impact. And I guess where we're at now is, can we measure that impact and look at the evaluation as a funder? Because when we send out money into the world and we see research and we get a research project back, we have a tick the box to say that this research project has been completed and we paid all of the money. And the researchers are very happy because they have a number of scientific articles in relation to this. But is that knowledge getting there? So what we're going to look at is an outcome evaluation. Is like, what impact has this research had? It's quite challenging, but it's something that, at least I think it came up in the last talk as well, I keep referring to that, is with evaluation, do something. It's like, can we even, at the minute, list all of the projects that have fed into the number of PhDs that's supported in some way? Can we identify how many publications have come from the research? Things like that. And maybe, like, again, we're obviously always oversimplifying things, is there's extra layers of complexity. So for example, I'd imagine with the Fair Plus project, you have another layer because you have different working groups, and then you have a three-dimensional challenge of trying to keep different work packages together. So there's parallel things going on as well. So there's a lot more work to do on this, but I hope we're going in the right direction. So then moving on to impact of where we bring it all together. So I talk about the policy, the international standard. That gives us an opportunity to feed in what's called the code compliance process with WADA. And this is very preliminary data based on the first round. But what we can see is that from all of the responses to the code compliance questionnaires is that already the impact that it's having. So of the people that have responded so far, and it's a nice thing to do that I'm sure a lot of researchers would love to do, is make a response to a questionnaire mandatory. And so we know that it's 100% of everybody that's responding, or everyone that we have sent out the code compliance questionnaire to. So what we see is 84% of our stakeholders have an education plan, compared to in 2017, only 38% have. So what happened in the middle there? The international standard happened. Evaluation reports, feeding in from what's been discussed already. Evaluation is still something that's finding it a challenge to get embedded in the system. But you're required to do evaluation of your education program. And it speaks to exactly the point Erik said. If you're doing something, surely you want to know whether it's working or not. And the argument of, well, it's taking resources away from me delivering the program, well, then you're just feeling around in the dark, really, if you don't know or if you don't invest something in understanding the impact that you're having. Educators, we're now seeing educators, we're getting numbers for the system. We're seeing on average 13 educators, trained and authorized educators there. And the good thing as well is from us as the regulator enabler, the enabling part is that we're able to see where the demand for our resources are, because as part of our enabling role, we're developing athlete curriculums, we're developing model athlete pathways like the one I just shown with the wider team, is that we're seeing, well, there is a demand. These are the tier 1 and tier 2 signatories which are more developed. So we're seeing if these are using this, well, we can see, well, actually there is a demand maybe for some of the resources that we're doing. So even though we're not delivering, we're providing resources that people are using. So it helps us to understand that a bit better. Now, just to then wrap up, considering we are talking about recreational athletes, and I put a big caveat on what I'm about to present because I do pester the IT team for all of the data from the code compliance stuff, and they give me lots of spreadsheets and things like that, not really amenable to integration. So what we're looking at from the first batch of 117 anti-doping organizations, because we do ask about recreational athletes, just to kind of provide some framing for what we're discussing today, is that 56 of those identified and provided a number of recreational athletes in their system. So according to the code, it's up to people to define what they have. And it's not surprising that the majority of those 56 gave figures were coming from national anti-doping organizations. And the number, again, big caveat, is 36.8 million recreational athletes across those 56 anti-doping organizations. So, like, I mean, again, without the context of which countries, there's a lot of big countries, a lot of big sports, and there's potential for overlap as well between the both. So it needs to go through a big cleaning process, but it's just, I'll show you where I want to get to. So there's 876,000 on average recreational athletes for each of these anti-doping organizations. And this is the interesting part, is we asked how many recreational athletes were educated under your system. So that's not the number 24, that's the number of anti-doping organizations who said they have educated recreational athletes. Not surprising, the majority of those are national anti-doping organizations. So then we're looking at about 300,000 recreational athletes that have been educated within the system of these first 117 anti-doping organizations. 14,000 on average, and this is the kind of part that I maybe wanted to highlight, is to see whether this is consistent, because I'm sure these figures will change as we keep doing this, is 0.8% of the listed recreational athletes were educated. So I'm really hoping that that's the less than 1% that are actually doping, but I'm not sure if that's going to be the case. But that just kind of gives a framework of where we kind of sit right now after just very initial phase of asking our signatories what are they doing with recreational athletes. And of course, it comes back to, I think, Liene's point is, and her skepticism maybe would be, this is self-report. So if we were to go in and have a look at this, what would it be like as well? So just to go back and quickly say, well, what do people do, or where does then the recreational part come in? Because we're seeing this translucent box here. And I was really delighted to see Liene present the idea of the governments becoming more proactive and wanting to get involved, because that's probably where they sit in terms of the resources. But it should be done in cooperation with the national anti-doping organizations in some way. And of course, WADA has resources there that have been developed in partnership with other international organizations for, say, children and school sport and all the way along. So there is an opportunity for resources to be available, and we're going to continue working with the Council of Europe to develop that further. And that's all well and good, and it's nice to simplify everything. And we're talking about research informing, at least framing what we're doing. We funded one research project last year in Australia with Scott McLean and his research team, and they went and mapped the anti-doping system and all the stakeholders in one sport, in the football codes in Australia. So they wanted to see where all of the interactions were between all of the different organizations. And this is what they found. So again, credit to Scott and his team for putting this slide together, which I can imagine would have been absolutely tedious. But what it shows is that WADA is at the top left, the athletes all the way at the bottom right. So look at all of the different players and organizations and everything that come into play before something reaches the athlete. So the idea of WADA directly engaging with an athlete becomes something, particularly with the resources available, it shows how unfeasible that is. And even if you try and simplify that, and again, thanks to Scott for doing this as well, is you look at all the groups, there's still a lot going on before you get to the athletes or potentially an anti-doping rule violation. And then you throw in all of the WADA code, all of the compliance, the signatories, everything that they look to do. Then you throw in the education requirements about who's supposed to do what, where. And then on the other side, you have all the sanctioning, the testing process, the results management process, whistleblowing. Then it becomes very clear that this is where the challenge is in the real world. So we can talk conceptually, and this is sometimes maybe where the tension is between the researchers. So the researcher will come with this nice diagram saying, look at this is how you're supposed to do it. And then the practitioner will say, well, yes, that's a lovely diagram, but that does not reflect my real world. So all the time engaging and making sure that different groups understand each other's reality becomes essential for that. And I think I am 90 seconds under time, so I will take that opportunity to take a glass of water. So thank you for your time. Gurav Milamahagat.
I don't think you need to sit down. Oh, okay. You can have the glass of water, but no seat. Fantastic job, Tony. That's the third talk we've had in 3 days. You've absolutely confirmed that you were the right person to finish up, because I think you've pulled everything together and set it in a global context. Europe is clearly a section of the world, very important in terms of anti-doping, but it's not the whole world. And setting it in a context is crucial like that. Not least of all because came from the concussion conference last week in Amsterdam. You're trying to lay down fantastic clinical protocols for dealing with athletes who have head injuries. Well, you can do the state-of-the-art stuff if you're lucky enough to live in a country which has absolutely top-class technological medicine, and you've got health insurance to get to it, and so. But that means nothing to 98% of the world. So setting the global context is critical here. We've got massive diversity already in Europe. Another challenge to go beyond Europe. But here we are in Europe. So let's start with the questions. We've got about 15 minutes. Who's going to kick us off?
Well, thanks again, Tony. Excellent talk. I think maybe this is more a comment. I think sometimes it's the small little tweaks that makes you go eureka or aha. I see this, and you hit the nail with the analogy to the farmers.
who sits at the pub and getting their information there. And I think sometimes we need to switch that perspective to get an understanding of the complexity of the system. And we sometimes tend to think directly from here's the researcher, here's the educational campaign, and here's the athlete, job done. But it also made me think about a conference I attended last week, where the discussion was, how come it's so difficult to translate the knowledge we have from research on performance enhancement, how we enhance an elite athlete's performance down to the coach and the athlete. And the challenge seems to be exactly the same, except that perhaps the coaches and the athletes here are much more interested to get onto that knowledge on how I can run 5 seconds faster in my 400 meter run. But the challenge appeared to be the same, namely the translational steps. And you had that image with the puzzles that fit nicely with each other, but actually, again, in the real world, they do not fit, and they don't have that exact shape where you can just put them in. And the challenge seems to be that how do we actually merge these puzzles, and can we just force them into place sometimes or whatever? So yeah, a thought-provoking and yeah, more comment than a question. Thanks for that.
I can respond quickly and just say I think that is possibly the challenge going forward, is the translation and that mobilization. I'm trying not to use translation, because when I say translation at WADA, that means translating actually text into different languages. But that the dissemination and the uptake is going to be key. And it comes back to the point around the farmer is, how do we package the knowledge and communicate it in a way that it will be received? Because just because you communicate something and you think you've communicated as you intended, doesn't mean that it was received in that way. So first of all, I think we have to understand how it was received, and then that's where the research comes in, is then how do we make those interventions more developed and more effective.
Just to be brief comment back, some of the research that's been done in compliance in medicine, it mirrors some of this, because we want to understand how we can increase compliance with medicine and patients, for instance, diabetes medicine and so on. And one of the surprising findings I've been reading there is that it's much easier for a vet to convince his customer that the dog needs to take the medicine, and there will be almost 100% compliance. The dog will take the medicine because the owner will give it to it. But if the owner himself gets diabetes, there will be like 50 to 60% compliance, much less. So there is something here in the relationship also between the knowledge and how you, again, translate that knowledge into behavior.
Yeah, I think it comes back to that knowledge pathway, is where they're getting the information, and also where is the influence? Who is influencing? So, like I said, it goes back to the farmer. Who's going to influence him? It's the guy at the other end of the bar on the pub stool. So, who's influencing the athlete? Who's in there? And that comes back to the tailoring. Not all athletes are going to receive the information. So, in different sports, the coach has more power, has more influence. In others, it's the doctor. In others, it's your peers, parents, depending on what stage of your pathway you're at. So, that, and you touched on it, Mike, is about the tailoring becomes quite complex, but it's doing something to move in that direction and getting the feedback so we can understand, well, what is the most effective way to do that?
Well, I think, if I may, I gave a presentation at some WADA conference 10 or 15 years ago in Korea, I think, maybe 20 years ago. I'm not convinced this is the right model. And if you look at the medical ethics literature, and in particular organ donation uptake, very scarce resource. Everybody wants to see that the resource is well taken up, that people adjust their lifestyles so that the scarce resource isn't wasted because of the behavioral issues of the patient. And part of the challenge there is compliance is a top-down concept. It's a concept that lawyers operate with very readily because they set the standard and they look for adoption of the standard in terms of behaviours, compliance. And an alternative model is concordance, and I think that's probably the better concept for recreational doping, because what you want to tack to is the values that people have. So you want them to share the same message rather than just make sure they're conforming to a standard set by somebody in Montreal who isn't really sure how it fits in Dakar. Yeah. or any of the other areas of the world outside of Europe. So yeah, some interesting thoughts for there about what's the nature of the relationship that you want to build up in it. I think if anything came out of Andrea's talk, it's values-based and it's supported very much by the NADO messages. So just a little bit of pushback there. Andrea.
Thank you, Donny, for your talks. And while we were talking, I was thinking about our specific context about recreational athletes. And the idea of the similarities with the farmers' diagrams has given me a sort of insight that I'm sure we have, everybody. So probably we need to know more about the language of these people, the meaning of some terms, because I mean, farmers, they meet each other, they're a community. If we don't still have, you know, a kind of definition of recreational sports, it's very difficult to believe that we can know where they met or where they exchange knowledge. So do you think that in parallel for the future, together with this top-down, in like say international standard education that comes from top-down categories, there will be also a sort of from the bottom to the top work to the other, starting from the language that each culture within sports speaks?
Yes, I think so. And speaking to the International Standard for Education, and what we talked about last night is that it actually did come from the bottom up. And in terms of developing policy, you can't mandate something from Montreal and then say this is now the way of the world. Is that if there's a process by which we're talking in a global context, is there a way to at least allow an avenue or a channel for those stakeholders that are going to be impacted by what we do to feed into what that policy becomes? And it becomes this, like, I mean, again, we're talking in theory, the virtuous cycle of policy, research, and practice, because that's the theme of what we're talking about, is how do you build that into a system? That we don't say, let's start with a policy, okay, let's then try and get everyone to do this. And it maybe speaks to your point a little bit, Mike, is that where everyone is represented within the policy, then at least it gets more buy-in. It might not be all things to all people, but it forms a consensus on this is the most appropriate thing for this population. And then it gives an opportunity for whether it's a practitioner to have a basis within the policy to be able to deliver education. And I think that the second part of that also speaks to what Mike said earlier, is the idea of multidisciplinary. That's really clearly needed, particularly in anti-doping as well, because it's quite a technical field and there's a lot of technical language. And it speaks to the importance of having possibly, you know, someone with an education background is how are we now going to educate athletes when we talk about the prohibited list and what's a S0 and what's a specified substance, unspecified substance. So it's going to involve a lot of people and across a lot of disciplines all working together. But the top-down, bottom-up concept doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. They can work, I think, in parallel. And that's what we tried to do, I think, with the international standard and across all the standards and the development of the code.
Let's ask a little question about what's got to stay the same, what's allowed to be culturally different, because there's a famous concept in philosophy called family resemblances. So Wittgenstein was trying to argue there's no such thing as an essence to a concept, and somebody operationalized it in the following way. Think about this as anti-doping education. So over here you've got the following content elements: A, B, C, D. And go into the next country, you've got B, C, D, E. Go into the next country, you've got C, D, E, F. You can see after you've got to 5 countries, the 5th country has absolutely nothing in common with the first, other than the similarities and resemblances. Has WADA got to mandate what's core? It's all well and good saying, well, we have to rest it onto the NADOs and other providers of anti-doping education, but we can't mandate it. And I'm not sure about that. Otherwise, how do you know they're all doing the same thing? So is there perhaps a space for a policy discussion about what ought to be mandated? You must cover these topics. However you do it, the pedagogy has to fit the population, right? We don't mandate that. But is there a content that you think would be untouchable, and then there's other stuff that you're going to tailor according to the circumstance, whether it's sport type or age or educational attainment level or gender or whatever?
Yeah. I think that adaptability is essential. It's an essential part of the existing system. On the testing side, you have a test distribution plan that takes into account the risk analysis of individual sports. And it's the exact same principle with education, is being able to adapt to what's most appropriate for you. The idea of something being mandated, because what we have is a prohibited list. There is a line, whether you like it or not, it's there. And is that if you take a prohibited substance, you have committed an anti-doping rule violation in some way. So there has to be ways to make sure that athletes are informed of where that line is and how to, if they want, stay on the right side of it. And that's reflected both in the code in Article 18.2, where the topics are mandated, and everything after that, how you deliver those topics, is more over to you. My favorite example is in Jamaica. They built reggae into their education program. So there's no way we can mandate reggae for everyone in education. That would be quite the interesting approach in Ireland, for example. So, but the topics would definitely need to do, because regardless of, when we're talking about values-based education, that's a very strong basis on which you want to support athletes to behave in line with their values. But at some point, they could be in danger of doing something that's misaligned with their values, whether they forget to fill out their whereabouts form, whether they forget to, or if they don't know there's a therapeutic use exemption if they're taking a medication. So therefore, they have to know this, and that has to be standardized. So, and with the education standard is that you can do it to, how you like, once it's informed by good pedagogy and once you're actually delivering accurate information. And what we're trying to challenge our stakeholders to do is kind of go beyond that, because we know that athletes need to know this stuff. We know that they need to understand it. But at the end of it, if they know and understand but they're not doing it, that's where the danger is, because they're not getting punished on what they know or don't know. They're going to get punished on what they do or don't do. So the education programs have to evolve to make sure that athletes are being trained with the skills and competencies to do what they're supposed to do. So if I take a supplement, am I following the correct risk management processes? If, as I said, the doctor says, here's a prescription, have I told that doctor I'm subject to testing? What's the process for that? So that's the behaviors. So, and I think that's, when you're saying what stays the same, what needs to move on, I see and many people have kind of come to this, is that we need to focus on the behaviors, and you start with measuring the behaviors, what athletes are doing, and then how do we effectively support athletes to behave in that way.
Except, because I'm sat next to a social psychologist here, except what's the relationship between those behaviors and values? And that's a killer question. Along with it, when everybody talks about values-based education, which values then? Right, so if you go down a gym where all they're interested in is getting as big as possible, as quickly as possible, well, they could get a values-based education, but we weren't thinking of those values. So I think there's going to be a really interesting process that's got to be aligned to this educational development about not just the mantra of values-based, but a real drill down. Which values do we think are multicultural? Mm-hmm. You know, because that's a real challenge in the modern sphere.
Also a challenge because I think there's 14 values listed in the code. So where do you start with? Which values are you promoting? But from the research, we see that the values that athletes have the vast majority are aligned to clean sport, to anti-doping. The idea of fairness, the idea of equality, inclusion, all of those are there. So I think sometimes the misnomer with values-based education is that there's a perception that we're trying to inculcate values onto people that don't have them. It's simply trying to reaffirm values that they already have and say, do you have a value of fairness? Well, yes. Well, then these are the behaviors you should do to align. And if you don't have those values, well, we built a massive testing infrastructure and complex that is waiting there, waiting to do it. So the idea is education first. And if those values aren't aligned, like, I mean, what are the international values? There's a certain point where you can't compromise because we have a line. So if you go beyond that line, that's where the testing, that's where all of the other architecture comes into play.
It's going to be a really good conversation around the NADAs. Are we really going to go to testing in recreational sport? And if so, what level? And is that a good use of resource? So you've just started a fire, and I'm going to damp it down straight away.
Thanks.
On your behalf, can I ask you to show your appreciation for a great talk? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Mike. And thank you, everyone, for your attention.
We're coming toward the close of the day, and I'm delighted to say that we've been joined by Georg Haeusler. Mr. Haeusler has just been appointed Director for Culture, Creativity and Sport in the European Commission. Congratulations. Prior to this, he was Director in another Commission department for 7 years. He joined the Commission back in 1999 and has held several senior posts, but was, before his quasi-political career, a PhD in law in '93. So, having just derided the lawyers, I'll take a step back now, just in case you give me a bit of critique here. But thank you very much for joining us. We know you've got an incredibly busy day alongside all the travel logistics, so we're very grateful you've joined us and very much look forward to hearing from you.
I could listen to this. This is very interesting. And you said I was in previous departments, working in different departments. Mind you, I was working in agriculture, and here I come and you talk about farmers. So it seemed to be just in the right spot. I probably have a few different views on what you said about farmers, but that's a different discussion. I actually just come back from an anti-doping conference in Prague, where we discussed for 2 days. It was extremely interesting. I think some of you have been there, and a lot of the topics you have touched upon here have been discussed there too. Now. The thing is, I think when we are discussing this subject here, and it's interesting in the presentation you just did, Tony, this divide between professional athletes and recreational normal sports, so to speak. The 38 million, I think you put that, by the way, not enough, because only 50% of Europeans do regular sports, so that's not good. But I think that's a difficult divide. And it's also a difficult divide in what are we supposed to do in, and this is where probably I can come in a little bit, in policy. And you know, we are not probably doing a lot in policy for various reasons. We can discuss about that briefly. And I think that the difficulty here is to say, and just to pick up on what you said, Mike, just recently, which values? I think it's very simple to me, but I'm a newcomer. Don't cheat. That's the value. Don't need anything else. I'm coming from an area where we are, in the European Commission in general, I think we have this idea of we do a lot of legislating. We do a lot of setting rules. And we do have this constant challenge of you having 27 different systems, 27 different countries with different cultures, different understandings, different whatever. But they have a common goal, common value, common direction, kind of. And on this one, I think the common one, it should keep it simple. Don't cheat. It's as simple as that, I think. And then let's see how you do it. Now, there is this difficult, I think, difficult balance to find. On one side, police. What is it? Catch and punish. I think what you say in the doping context. I think that's very important. This is something which is fundamental, and here I'm talking now about professional athletes. It's a little bit more delicate when it comes to recreational sports, and I think we're not very good at this. I mean, you're talking about a worldwide context. I'm only talking about the Europe 27. We're not good at this because we don't have a common set of rules. We don't have a common approach. We don't have a common legal system. In some countries it's criminals, in others it's not. We don't have a common set of substances which are recognized everywhere, or which are not recognized rather everywhere. We don't have the WADA list being translated into a medicine list. I mean, we're missing a lot of fundamentals, which is I think one of the fundamental problems we are having in this area. So we don't have common ground on what is good and what is bad. And we don't even have a common ground. I think in some member states there's not even a conscious, I say member states, but certainly some countries, there's not a consciousness that this is something criminal, potentially criminal if you do that, and that's the reason you have to punish it in an adequate way. Now, you know, we are talking here in a very very, very difficult ground from the European Union perspective, because you know, obviously, that we do have a very small competence only in sport. We don't have really any legislative power, so there is not, as we normally would probably do as the European Commission, to make a proposal to discuss with stakeholders, to discuss with Parliament, and then do something about it. We can simply not do it. It's also we cannot do it because member states don't want us to do it. I mean, let's face it. If it's not in the treaty and if it's not competence of the European Union to do something about it, it's because nobody wants us to do it. Not nobody, but I think a majority of member states don't want us to be handling this. Now, the thing is, what can we do? I think what we are doing here is, I think we can build a lot of building consciousness, building a culture, building an anti-doping culture. And there again, I think it's a different thing, and that I would really make a distinction between recreational sport for hobby and professional sport, because I think what we are talking about, the vast majority, it's about education, it's about training. And by the way, the conference I've been assisting to, was half of the conference was about education and how many activities actually already done in member states via the NADAs, via other organizations to build up a kind of a system where about kids, parents, coaches on the ground level, on the grassroots level, get the right information and get the right culture into their head that they should convey to kids if they come to sport, that this is something which is not good for their health, it's not good for their value system, and it's certainly not good for sports at all. But then there's the other thing, it's the athlete, and there, what you were saying in one of your interventions, I would be a bit stricter there, because for an athlete it's not just going somewhere and say, you know, I don't understand the language and somebody wants to test me, and why does he want to test me? I think there should be a clear set of rules, and arguably there's not. There should be a clear rule what is allowed and what is not allowed, and if an athlete does not obey to those standards, he should be or she should be seriously challenged on legal grounds, being, you know, excluded from the sports activity. I think that we should be very, very clear, and we should also have a very clear language there. It's not about, because actually in the conference there was a bit of this, because there were athletes talking, saying, yes, I was, you know, for the first time in an international competition, I didn't speak the language, and suddenly they came with all this testing thing, and I was shocked. It was a trauma to me. I mean, frankly, that is not acceptable. It's probably not his fault or her fault. It's probably his National Olympic Committee's fault. It's probably his National Athletic Association's fault. But I think every athlete who is going to any professional competition should be well aware of what is expected from them, and should also be well aware of the consequences if they don't accept it. And I think we don't have this common rule set yet anywhere, and certainly not in the European Union, because we are not able to convey it. Now, what I wanted to say as well is, I think to have a few of the controversial issues as well, to list them, and I think I mentioned it briefly already, to this list of prohibited products, the WADA list. How could we and what could we do in order to make it kind of a list which is respected by everybody? I think that's a big challenge, not only in the European Union, obviously, but I think that's key to any successful worldwide challenging of doping. I think also issues which has been discussed quite a lot in this conference as well, it's the right of an athlete, data protection, constitutional rights versus the right of the institution controlling. It's a very, very difficult issue. There's actually, I understand, a court case which we are expecting the result of, which is going to be key, whether, you know, what is more important, the individual rights of the athlete or the right of the community to control the athlete. But that's, of course, an extremely sensitive issue because it's health data. And courts tend to be extremely restrictive when we are talking about health data. Now, the good thing, I think, coming to your project, and you really draw the attention to the across-the-counter medications, painkillers, etc., so that not the real doping material, but the material which is extremely dangerous. And I think there, your project is going to be very useful for us as well for having a basis for communication, for having the research actually to be able to talk about this in a very convincing way. You know that we have been doing quite a number of things in our work program, 21-24. Doping is top on the agenda of this. Erasmus Plus, obviously, you are well aware because this project is funded by it, and rightly so. And I think it's very good that we have this kind of priority in Erasmus Plus sport, because there's a common ground and a lot needs to be done here. Now, I think to conclude my few remarks, it is an uphill battle where I'm standing from the Commission side, to be able to do something really constructive and something convincing. Because I know it sounds, and I know we are criticized for that, rightly so, that the Commission says, yeah, we're doing some studies, we're doing this, we're doing that, we are supporting some projects, but we are not really getting into the materia. And I think you understand our limitations because they simply don't let us. I don't think it would be the Commission who would be refraining from it, but the Commission is, of course, bound by the treaties. We are bound by the competences we have, and that's the reason, I think, why we have to be relatively modest in what we can do, but at least we can shout, and we can talk, and we can use our platforms in order to make sure that this is an important issue. But thanks a lot for your project, and thanks a lot for letting me talk to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really, really great that you, so early in your tenure, were prepared to come up. We're well aware that you've had much more experience in other sectors. And I think the challenge you point out is how will these rules apply from a sector of elite sport where we've known how the system works into the common population, with a public health message, maybe more than the don't cheat message. And it's the sort of sophistication and nuance around those different norms for the public health population. And I think we've been trying to struggle to find our way through here, and it's really just at the beginning of that journey. But thank you very much indeed for giving us your time. We do hope that when you've read the commitment to action that we've formed as a group of people, you'll think it's a reasonable way forward. We certainly hope so. But once again, thank you very much for taking the time this afternoon.
My pleasure.
It just really falls to me then to close the afternoon. I don't know why not two microphones, but there we go. Let's take one down. First off, thanks to all the presenters. It's been a very difficult journey through COVID, and to stay on course with already very challenging projects is really it's a minor miracle, really. So thank you very much for sticking at it and producing such a great set of reports, all of which will be publicly available. I have also to thank Kira and her colleagues at Europe Active, like the swan floating across serenely, but underneath paddling like mad. Thank you very much for what you've done, not just today, but for the whole of this project. But really, the back staff of Europe Active have worked with us for nearly a decade now. So a big thanks to all of those, including some people who may have moved on from the organisation. And my last thanks is a big thanks to Cliff Collins, the senior advisor at Europe Active, because really, without your vision back in whenever it was, 2012 or whatever, none of this would really have happened. And who could have foreseen the way that WADA have shifted their code, the direction of NARDOs, the production of an international standard? All this means that the research that's been funded by Erasmus Mundus over the last 8 years is really going to come to fruition, I think, and possibly the lever will be WADA's recognition of this special population that the original policy documents, tools, weren't really designed for. And now we've got the hard work of trying to apply them sensitively, proportionately, in an impactful way. So it's been a fantastic afternoon. Great morning this morning. Thank you all for your contributions, and I look forward to seeing you somewhere soon when this agenda hits the headlines again. Thanks a lot.